take your seats, we'd love to get started. Thank you all for coming out in what was supposed to be a monsoon. Hopefully this will be the worst of what we are seeing. As you know, quite a while ago there were some situations in Highland Park that prompted some of our residents and the council to start thinking about what we can do to look at our police practices in town and where we go from there. So Dr. DeLacy, who will be speaking momentarily, and his team dug into the numbers provided by our police department. It was not an easy process, and quite frankly, the start of some of the changes you'll be seeing came from the realization that the data needed to be better synced. I'm sure Dr. DeLacy will talk a little about that, or the chief. And we are starting to move forward on better practices for collecting data as well. So at this point, I'm going to ask Councilwoman Foster Dublin, who is the liaison to our Public Safety Committee, to come and say a few words, and we'll get into the program.
Thank you, Mayor. Welcome, everyone. And I know this report is long overdue. We should have had it done probably a year and a half ago. But I'm happy that we had an opportunity when I reached out to Dr. DeLacy and told him what the problem that we were having and that we need help with the report and we need for someone to go from soup to nuts and do a deep dive. He was willing to take on the process, and it took some time because he'll explain later what were some of the issues, why it was so long overdue in coming, but it's here, and him and his team worked really hard while he was obtaining his doctorate, and he has a huge team that he put together to do the research and to bring us what we have tonight. And we are open and for any kind of questions that you may have on the report. The report will be posted on the website, and we'll have some other presentation about some of the things that has been done during the report and beyond by our own police department. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. DeLacy to please start the presentation, and please introduce your team.
Thank you, Councilor. Thank you, Mayor. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Yeah, look at me. Look, I know you've been up as long as I've been up. I got up about 5 o'clock this morning. Got my 2 miles in. So I know some of you have been up that early, right? So let me just say thank you. First of all, let me just talk about the team. So to my right is Dr. Jason Skeeter. Jason Skeeter is a mathematician on the team, came on board. He's out of New York, so I'm thankful they came from New York to be here today. So I want to say thank you and give you a round of applause and acknowledgement for being here. Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz is also, he's a PhD out of Brooklyn College. He's been over there. He's a Fulbright scholar. He travels the country doing a lot of work around prison reform and incarceration, and recently coming back from Pakistan. So I'm thankful to have him on this team. And so I want to say thank you. My other teammates are not here, and some are on the way coming in from New York City. Dr. Gilbert Lewis is a quantitative studies professor over in New York at 2 universities. We also have Dr. Keyshawn Hickman, who's he's an active duty lieutenant over in New York City, NYPD, as well as Dr. Tyrone Powers. He's a former state trooper in the state of Maryland, as well as an FBI agent and a director of Criminal Justice Institute in Maryland in the DC area, doing all sorts of homeland security work. And I think in Ms. Michonne Decoto, she's a doctoral candidate. At another doctoral program, she's actually a data scientist, and she's on the team and on her way. So I just want to jump right into it, actually, and talk about, try to figure out how to do this with 2 hands. I want to thank, first of all, the borough for simply being open and transparent. I want to be very clear about a few things. One, the borough was extremely transparent. I'm a retired police sergeant from East Orange, New Jersey. Did 20 years on the police force. I've been all over the world. I've consulted for a variety of people. I'm holding a doctorate, executive leadership, from St. John Fisher College, and my most recent research is examining factors related to police officers shooting unarmed black males using a firearm simulator in the North Jersey Police Department. And so we've gone into places before, and people are usually very closed, unwilling to share information, and my colleagues in the police department were very open. And so, Chief, I want to say to you, the captain, as well as the mentor, I'm going to give you a round of applause. Absolutely. conversation often, and we came down to visit many times over the course of the year. We got to meet with Dr. Hale as well, my colleagues and someone on the council, but certainly just trying to get the work done. And looking at it, we were looking at simply, was there disparate treatment, particularly of African Americans, relative to traffic stops here in this community. And so, having done that, that's what we looked at. We looked at roughly 14,203 traffic stops, and we'll tell you what the data says on that. I'll try to go through it. I'd rather get through much of it as we can without using a lot of numbers, but go through it and then talk through whatever you want to talk about. So the approach, just make sure I'm in the right place, right? So our approach was that we examined, I said 14,203 traffic stops, and as a result of that, we were also looking at the data from 2014 here, I'm thinking about January 1st, 2014 to 2018. We looked at 5 years. And we initially were looking at the Enforces system, and what Enforces is a data collection system that many police departments use. What we did not know at the time was that there were 2 systems. And so when we began to look at the Enforces data, what we realized is that all of the data was not there. So we were looking for primarily some of the racial data, we were looking for gender, looking for sex, all of that kind of stuff. And then we found out that there was also the InfoCop data. And the 2 systems don't talk to each other. So half of what we needed was in one system, the other half of what we needed was in the other system. And so we spent a great deal of time trying to understand, are we going to be able to get them to talk to each other? We sat on a committee meeting with the police personnel as well as Dr. Hale, and we talked about what the options were. We came up with several different options, and of course, the city made the decision to get a patch that would talk to both systems so that they now collect data in real time, daily, weekly, monthly, and can look at the data to make decisions about policing, which we thought was a great thing. That was also one of our recommendations, and I also want to point out that of the 5 recommendations that were being made in the study, 4 of them were already implemented before we finished the study and actually had the final drafts. There were a total of 19,023 traffic stops, but we could only use 14,203 of usable data. And I know some people ask, well, what wasn't used? When we cleaned the data, there were 4,820 stops that actually did not have gender, race, or sex there. And therefore, we couldn't use it because we had no way of determining who was stopped in those instances. Now, some people will say, well, why weren't they captured? I don't know. Right? There were different ways. So they went from a paper system at one point to go to a data collection system digitally. Sometimes motor vehicle stops, as I understood, were recorded by the dispatcher. Sometimes they're recorded by someone else. So I worked in the police department 20 years. I've been a dispatcher, and I've also been someone else. Sometimes you get it all, sometimes you do not. And so that was something that we looked at. I'll answer questions at the end if you just hold on to them. And so that's something that we also looked at. So we were not able to assume, to calculate, to determine what those 4,800 stops were, and we talked about that as some of the limitations of the study. And then we used an inter-rater reliability. So what were we doing? So we had the math folks internally that were looking at the numbers and making sure that the data was collected properly and that we were appropriately accounting for the data, but we also wanted to make sure that it was correct and it was accurate. So we also sent it out to statisticians who also took and looked at the data to make sure that we had similar results, because of course mistakes can be made. And we used as a benchmark, and I know that some folks around the council and in the community, and some of the literature suggests that the population data is not the strongest benchmark that could be used. And I know that we've got some recommendations that we could have used the county data, which would have changed the percentages in terms of population of the racial groups in and around the community by maybe 3 to 5%, which certainly would be accurate. However, initially when we designed the study, we were using the pink slips, as they're called, right, Chief? Yes. The pink slips is how they were recording stops. We were going to use a year of pink slips as baseline data and then compare the 5 years to the year pink slips. But because the pink slips were not in a way that we could collect all of it for an entire year, we could not use it. As a result, we had to change that design. And so that's what we got. So we were supposed to use a veil of darkness. The veil of darkness basically assumes that if police officers are biased in their stopping of people of color particularly, then in the daytime you can see what color person you're stopping in a motor vehicle, which makes sense. And therefore we use a veil of darkness, which simply says that we will take the twilight period between 5:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. and use it over a course of years. Then we can account for daylight savings time, but you won't be able to see the race of the person in the car. And therefore, that may be a more accurate predictor of who's being stopped actually, as opposed to a bias. Well, again, because we had to toss out in the cleaning 4,820 stops, what it meant was that if we reduced the stops all the way down to 530 to 930, then we would shrink the sample size even more. And we would have more stops thrown out than those that are in the sample size. So that was the concern, so the decision was made that we would use it and change and modify the veil of darkness from sunrise to sunset and from sunset to sunrise. That's where you get the modified veil of darkness. And the categories that we looked at were Black or African American, Hispanic or Latinx, white or Caucasian, and then we combined Asian and Pacific Islander because the population was so small, those numbers were small. So we used sunrise to sunset. So the total stops in the daytime were 8,169 stops, or 57% of the stops in the daytime. Males were 58% of that population. Females were 40%, and 52 were blank. And nighttime total stops were 6,000, which were fewer. Males were 4,000, which is 67% of that. And females were 1,900, or 32%, and blank were 29. Highlights from the report. One, we told you the size of the sample that was analyzed. There were only 53 arrests of all stops. And I want to say that, and that's important. I said this to the officers yesterday. If we were looking at a department that I would say structurally and inherently is a biased department, then I think the arrest numbers should be much more significant. 53 is a very small number for 14,000 stops. I worked in East Orange, and I can tell you in a 5-year period, I absolutely locked up more than 53 people over a 5-year period. And let's be clear, some of the things we were not able to look at. We could not tell whether or not the arrest was, that the stops were because you sent off the license plate reader. Because if the reader goes off, it flags your car regardless of your race. We could not tell that. There are some things that there's no discretion allowed. For example, a drunk driver, there's no discretion. You're unlicensed, there's no discretion. You're a suspended driver, you're uninsured. There's things where, regardless of what your race is, you're going to be stopped. And appropriately so, and you should be ticketed. So those were some of the things. 4,820 stops were incomplete, lacking race, ethnicity, or gender. Black males were approximately 2.5 times more likely to be stopped in the daytime. Black females were 1.22 times more likely to be stopped at night versus white or Hispanic Latinx drivers. Asian drivers were 1.5 times more likely to be stopped at night versus white or Hispanic Latinx drivers. And white Caucasian drivers were stopped approximately 30% less likely to be stopped during the daytime for traffic violations relative to the population. And so the other categories were higher, whites were less. And then there was the data collection. I think this is still me. Dr. Skeeter, you want me to go through? Yes, let me just go through this last piece. So what we looked at was categories. We looked at enforcers, and enforcers was able to give us certain categories. So we had the case number, the driver's race, the ethnicity, the age of the driver, gender, the license plate state, and the disposition. We broke it into 3 categories. We were looking at summonses, warnings, and arrests. So we wanted to see were certain groups warned more frequently than not, were certain people actually summoned more than others, or were certain people arrested more than others. And I told you the arrest number was very small at 53. That's a very, very small number.
All right, so I'm not a former police officer, so I'm not gonna have the same verbiage that Dr. Davis had coming up here speaking so confidently about the practices of the police department. I am a math teacher, been one for 15 years, middle school math. You can say there's a correlation between that, but I'm just gonna simply speak, and I'm gonna give you, I guess, a better understanding of the tests that were run and what it means to run these tests, so that when you hear the findings, you have a better understanding of what those findings are. So we ran several tests. We ran the descriptive statistics, which basically just lays out all of the descriptions and gives you the percentages of everything. You know, the frequency analysis does very similar, right? It tells you the frequency in which a particular group was stopped. And a chi-square test is another test that we administered that talks about the interactions between 2 different variables. So daylight versus Hispanic males was the correlation that they'll be stopped. So I'm gonna give you an understanding of what those are, or what those tests are, so that when you hear the findings, you'll have a better understanding of what that is. So the analysis up here, as you can tell, with the Asian population, the African American population, we were able to look at the residents in the town. And again, what we did was when we looked at the data that we received from 2014 to 2018, we compared it to the census that was taken in 2010 that gave us an understanding of the population of people in that community at that time. So it should be fairly similar with respect to any changes that were made over those previous years. So what I want to talk about now is what a chi-square test is, right? So a chi-square test is intended to test how likely it is that an observed distribution is due to chance. So what does that mean? That means that it measures how well the observed distribution of data fits with the distribution that is expected if the variables are independent. So as we were talking about, we're looking at two different independent variables to see what's the likelihood that something would occur. So we looked at cross tabulations, and that's the word I was trying to think of earlier when we were talking. So cross tabulations, we looked at the relationship between light visibility and race of driver stop. We looked at the relationship between light visibility, which is part of the veil of darkness theory, and race of driver stop, that's male only. We looked at the relationship between light visibility and race of driver stop, that's female driver only. We looked at the race of driver stopped, the gender of driver stopped, and if they received a summons. We looked at the race of the driver stopped and the gender of the driver stopped if they received a warning. So within and between groups, we can predict based on race, will you be stopped? That's what this chi-square test is supposed to determine. And so we looked at that, and that gave us a more specific understanding of the results, right? Relative to just a frequency analysis that just gave you the likelihood that someone was going to be stopped, right? This went very specific and looked at cross tabulations between independent variables. Okay. And if you have any questions about that, please write them down, and I'll be happy to address those later. So Dr. Davis is going to come up and share the findings.
Thank you. So is there a difference in traffic stops between races in Highland Park by police officers? African Americans were stopped at a rate of 17.76%, while whites were stopped overall at 43.26%. African Americans, I think, were 7.9 or 7.3% of the population, so clearly that's a number larger than the population. And we acknowledge as one of the limitations is that we don't know that everyone stopped was a resident. So I want to say that clearly. It just simply says that those that were stopped were African American. They could have been traveling through, they could have been passing by, and that's again one of the things we wanted to do in the study was take a look at locations, because you can't figure out who the resident is. You can't ask those questions, just randomly stop people and say you're a resident of the town. They're citizens and they're passing through. But we're simply capturing the data at that particular time, right? The rate for African Americans in the daytime was 16.86%, and the nighttime was 8. So roughly 17 to 19% of the time African Americans were stopped in the data that we examined. Whites were stopped at a rate of 45.89% in the daytime and 39% in the evening. The research question two is there a difference in stops between races in Highland Park Borough by police officers as a function of day or night? So we looked at it. So African Americans, as we said, were stopped from sunrise to sunset 1,377 times, while whites were stopped 3,749 times during the same time period, sunrise to sunset. Sunset to sunrise, which would be the evening time for us. African Americans were stopped 1,146 times, whites were stopped 2,395. Is there a difference in outcomes of police stops for different races from 2014 to 2018? We gave you sunrise to sunset. We gave you the whites for sunrise to sunset, blacks were stopped for sunset to sunrise, whites sunset to sunrise. There was no action taken on 6,700 stops. And that's important Because that means 6,700 times officers stopped people and they didn't take an action. They didn't deem it appropriate to give a ticket. They didn't give a warning. There was no action taken. And so we think that is very significant when we're talking about what the culture of the department looks like overall and how police are interacting during that time period. Blacks were warned or no action taken 1,338 times, about 10%, larger than the population. Whites were warned or no action taken 29% of the time. So interestingly enough, whites were warned at 29% of the time. They represent about 60% of the population. So we didn't see that as significant in terms of the favorability toward whites versus other groups. Asians were stopped 3,300 times, which we thought was significant when we looked at it and we began to look at some things more specifically and just do some anecdotal things, but it was a high number we thought relative to the population. And research question 4, are African American males or females disproportionately stopped, summoned, or warned in relationship to the other groups? African Americans and Asians were disproportionately stopped relative to their size in the population in this community. That's the disproportionality. And once again, I make the point, as I said with the officers, that talks about what was captured in a particular 5-year period at that time. That does not mean necessarily that that's what the attitude is today. That doesn't mean necessarily that that's what's happening to residents. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're not appropriate stops. It simply means that we're capturing the time that these are the numbers at that particular time. African American drivers stopped at a rate of 17.76. African American daytime and nighttime stops, again, we told you 17 to 19%. Whites were stopped at 43%, and white daytime, nighttime 45 and 39% respectively. Limitations of the study. Is that me? I'm sorry. Okay, I'll do it. So data collection challenges. We told you that we had major challenges collecting the data. It took us roughly 10 months because we were trying to get those systems to communicate with each other. They just did not. They weren't designed that way. They by 2 different companies. The department, I guess between the department and the borough and the committee, made sure that the money was in place so that they could get a patch that would make sure that they could talk and they could pull that data down regularly. White Hispanic data was disaggregated. That was another challenge. So what I learned was that at about 2010, there was a decision made not to disaggregate Latinos or Hispanics from white. And therefore, when we initially went through all the data, we noticed there was a large number for white stops. And as we began to look, we realized there was nothing for Latin people or Hispanic people. And so we had to disaggregate it. And that had to be done by going in manually, looking at the data and literally 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 to pull it out. And so that was eventually done, but that was a limitation. And so the sample size prevented us from doing the traditional veil of darkness, which we talked about, because we felt that it would be a too small sample to actually get a real study done with it. And then the time constraints limited the use of stronger county populations, which we acknowledge was raised and would have probably been stronger, or location benchmarks. Because what we really wanted to do at one point in the design, to see if we're catching people just passing through town. Are we catching them at, are there traffic traps or stops or activities going on that were planned at particular times in and around the community? We wanted to know, is there a community where there's a larger population of people of color than others, and are there stops near those areas? We didn't get to do that, so we think that's a limitation. It's something that should be considered in the future. And you're able to do it now because I know that there's a traffic cam that you've just occurred that now counts all of that, and you can literally see how many people are traveling through at a particular time. And I saw that as recent as yesterday. And the study did not compare traffic stop data for residents and non-residents, which we talked about. So we have some recommendations. 1, improve data collection and communication between the software systems. That's already been done. Additionally attached to that, one of the recommendations was that there be a data analyst for the borough, because other places have data analysts full-time and full departments. So for example, when we were working with enforcers, we did not know enforcers. My agency didn't use it, and Sergeant Russell, who's in the audience, a former police director of Trenton, I don't know if her agency used it, but we didn't know it. So we scoured New Jersey to find out what police departments were using it. And I can say the police director in Irvington, as well as Joe Santiago, who's been a director of a variety of places, made their staff available. And they had 5 people over 2 days of meeting train us on enforcers. And the reason we wanted to be trained was because when I came back to meet with Lieutenant Hamill, the reports that we were not able to do, we wanted to be able to help him run. And again, the department was very open to it. And so we were able to get reports out that we couldn't get before. So that was from getting that training for enforcers. And so that recommendation has been answered and done. Utilize data collection and analysis to strategies to improve and inform police decisions. I know that's being done now because they're collecting the data weekly, daily, and monthly, and using that to make decisions. We've talked with the chief, we've talked with the lieutenant, and so some of that is being done, and it was being done before we finished. Seek to understand officers' perceptions of racial profiling versus minority communities' perception, broken windows theory. The broken windows theory simply holds that that incivility and social disorder leads to crime. And so if you attack the small things, the larger things don't occur. And so the question is around how people are being engaged and how they feel they're being engaged. And so I know that some of the conversation has begun to happen, and this is one of those examples where you're having a conversation with the community about how they perceive the police versus how the police perceive their practices in and around the community. And that's important to do and to be ongoing. Include other groups affected by racial profiling. So one of the recommendations in the report was that the Arab community should be included, because that is a group that is actually being profiled, and there are others, but we highlighted that in the report because it happens going through the airports, it happens going through communities, and there are complaints that go on now around the Arab community. So we thought that should be considered. And then finally, provide explicit and implicit bias training for police personnel, and consider a longitudinal traffic study stop so that you can take this data but also look at data down the road, and now that the systems talk to each other, you can actually compare next year what stops look like compared to any of the years prior. I also need to acknowledge that when we looked at the years, they're not even. So one year we have 600 stops that are recorded, another year we've got 2,400, another year we've got 4,000. And so I can't explain that. We don't know if the 4,800 that were tossed out affected from those years because we didn't look at it from that point of view, but that could be the case. Also, we don't know how the data was being collected during that 5-year period. We know that as it went on, they collected more consistent data and more accurate data. And then finally, report traffic data annually to the public, which I understand is being done in these kinds of forums so people know exactly what's going on. Those are our presentations of the report, which I know the larger report is being made available. Are there questions? I know I saw one back here.
Yeah. 3 yes, no. The first is whether you're considerable experience, obviously. The first question is whether you, given your considerable experience, that you consider 25% of the total data collected over the 5-year period to be
Speaking to the mic so people at home can hear.
25% of the data you received were not usable because of lack of gender and race and ethnicity identification. So first question is, do you consider that to be unusually high? Second question is...
Let me take them one at a time, if I can.
Yeah, that's fine.
But go ahead, I'll go ahead. They're all related, I'll take them all.
They're all about the report. And the second is whether you broke out analyses by year. You're not running regression analyses, so you have degrees of freedom, I think, ample to do chi-square analyses by year, even if you have cases that are as low as 600 stops a year, that you could actually resolve questions about whether what the trend is over the 5-year period, so whether you did that.
Right.
The third would be, I have more, but other people here. The third is whether you conducted any analyses of the data that were not included in the report.
So let me start with the second one first. So Dr. Hale beat me to death with that one. So we did not do a trend analysis, and there were a whole bunch of things we did not do. And we did not do them, one, because we were coming up against a time constraint, and we had those issues, and there were all sorts of analyses that wanted to be done. Was there any data that we did not include in the report? I don't believe so, is my answer. And I say that because, of course, you don't have to use all the data that you collect, but we did not, I'm sorry, all the analyses and all the information that you come up with, you don't have to throw it all in the report. But I think that we put in all of the high points, obviously, on the slide, but there was nothing that we left out in terms of did we hide anything or did we not include something? No, we didn't run something and say we don't like the results, so we're not going to include it. Anything that we ran, we used, which is why we had internal and external folks running the same data at the same time and giving us back the results. So the math people were not comparing to Dr. Eric Heil from University of Tennessee, and we intentionally went outside of this area so that we felt that the information was more accurate. The first question that you asked in terms of 75%, we think it's a baseline, the 25% that we had to toss out. We couldn't use it. So at the end of the day, whatever I thought of it, we couldn't use it at all, which is what drove the decision to modify the veil of darkness, because it would reduce the sample size. So that's why we did that. So I think that's a good question. It's a fair question, and it's a fair criticism, right, in terms of the trend analysis.
Not of you guys, but of the department collecting the data. The 25% of data on this critically important issue don't contain that label. Is that
Well, I think a couple of things, right? And I come out of a police department, I come out of East Orange, I spent 20 years there, and I came out of a department that was transitioning from very much like this one, from paper to digital. And I'll say this, you know, coming into what other people are doing in other agencies, in larger agencies, right? And so I think that, and that's why I talk about the transparency, and let me just be candid. Coming in, I knew that I was coming in with baggage, right? I'm a black guy who has fought police departments all across the country, and folks are nervous about what position I was going to take, and the impetus for this even being done, as I understood, was coming from the black community and other concerned groups of people. So I thought that we were actually best fit to come in, because we come in with folks on one side saying, well, he's going to wear them out. And we got police officers saying, what is he going to do to us, right? And so that's the space we were in. But when we met with the city government, we were very honest about being academicians. We did not charge a fee, let me say that up front so that we're clear. We charged nothing. We worked very hard for a year. My team worked hard. They come in from New York. We were here yesterday, and they came in again from New York. No one charged the fee because we did not want anyone to say left or right that we were moving in a particular direction. Residents from this community, when we first came, called me. I was very honest and transparent about saying I got calls from residents. I was up because the residents know me as an activist in the community. And so I said to them, I can't go into detail with you about what I'm doing. I can only tell you that this is what I'm doing, and be very honest about that. And so we tried to be. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. As I said, and to be very transparent, Dr. Hale identified in one of the tables that there were numbers that were identical on a particular table. We looked at it, we sent it back out to statisticians. We were like, you know what, Dr. Hale, you were correct. That wasn't, when we sent it out for editing, those numbers were placed in there, because I don't do the editing. And so we made the correction, and we sent out the corrected revised report. And it didn't affect the outcome, but the numbers weren't in the right place in one particular category. And so we were very honest about that. And so I thank you for the question. Other questions?
Yeah, I was interested in the statistic that you showed about the number of stops that didn't have an action, they either had a warning or no action.
Right.
And the percentages that you showed, I'm not sure, I guess, how you interpreted them in terms of, what percentage of the no action and warning stops were black or white or Asian. But I guess I was curious about two things about that. One is, was there a statistic in the report that I missed about, for an individual black motorist who stopped, what was the likelihood that they were going to be let off with a warning or no action, or a particular white motorist, what was the percentage? Because that seems like it would tell you more about, were people being more preferentially treated after they were stopped, that kind of thing.
So we did not do that, right? So, and I can tell you that we did not, I'm almost certain we did not do that. We didn't predict whether or not you were going to get a warning. Mm-hmm. We were more concerned with what was going to happen to you punitively, mm-hmm, in terms of whether or not you're going to get a ticket or if you're going to get arrested. We did not predict whether or not you're going to get a warning, but we did articulate who got the warning and how much of the warning.
Okay, but I guess my question is sort of like, was there a statistic, was there a disparity in terms of once the police have stopped somebody, is that person more or less likely to get punitive action taken against them, as opposed to what percentage of the punitive actions were black, white, Asian?
Thank you. Which one is that?
And would that mean anything? I didn't know how to interpret what you did show in there.
So what we had was, there seems to be no difference in the summons to warning ratio, black and white people. They're both getting warnings around 50%, 54% of the time.
Okay.
So yeah, and we didn't thank you. So I know it's on paper, so, but and we didn't think, this is an interesting experience, right? An experiment. We didn't think, and let me go a little deeper, right? Sometimes I looked at raw data. I just went right in to take a deep dive in a particular year, just to randomly open it up and take a look and see what I'm looking at, right? And I didn't see things that jumped out at me individually and personally, just in my profession, that said, this is a problem, right? Now, does it mean that you don't have any officers that may be writing tickets specifically in some areas? No, it doesn't. I worked in an agency, let me be very honest, I worked in the Blackest Police Department in the state of New Jersey, East Orange. 90-something% African American, the community's 90-something%, the community's African American. People being stopped all the time and being treated disparately in a predominantly black community by black people. Because now we're talking about class struggle and poverty and all those other things. So, you know, it's not as simple as, well, if I'm black driving through, is this going to happen to me? Or am I going to be warned more because I'm black or more? Now, what we did identify, which is how we were able to get to the disparity, is that certainly whites were 30% less likely in some of the stops. That's a social reality, right? We all come to this experience with a bias, all of us. We all come to the experience with a preference. And so for me and for us as a team, the goal was to at least help the community get to a baseline and say, this is where we are, this is what our data shows, and this is what we want to do about it or not do about it. But at least we have it, and the folks that came in to look at it were being reasonable, being fair, and being transparent. If we made mistakes, we talked about mistakes. If we, like you asked about a trend analysis, we didn't do that. There was some feedback that I got. I call it criticism, but it's really feedback from my colleague, Dr. Hale. He sent me like 6 questions. I called him up. It was on the weekend, right? I said, hey, I appreciate it, right? He says, well, I thought you would. That's why I called, right? And I was very transparent about that because we can't be so sensitive, we on our side, that folks aren't going to look at what we're doing and run it through and run it through and run it through, and that's going to happen. Right? But we want to be also honest about it, and we want to be fair and reasonable. You know, we weren't looking for a gotcha. You know, the first thing we said when we met with the mayor and others was that the data are what the data are, and that's all we're going to say. This is what we're looking at. And for those that wonder, data is plural, right? So that's the first lesson that you learn when you go. And when you say data, I say, is he crazy? I need to figure out how to conjugate that verb. But data is plural, datum is singular. So that's what it is, all right? And so it was what it was, and we don't think that I'll be very honest, it's not as bad as I thought it was. I was expecting it to be really off the charts, to be honest. And that's what I didn't come in biased, I came in open because I had to meet with folks that didn't know me and didn't know what bias I was bringing. So I came right down the middle of the road. And folks they opened up the books and let us take a look. And I mean, what else can you ask for? Right? I think it's outstanding. A community comes out and you say, hey, this is what we found and this is what we want to do about what we found. But thank you for the question. There was a question over here. Gentleman here, check it.
Thank you.
I think one of the issues that concerned a lot of us in the reports that we were getting much earlier was also a seeming disproportion in the use of force. Was that something that at some point was going to be analyzed or will be analyzed or in any way came up in your analysis? Because the traffic stops is an important point, and we're thankful that that was done, but I wonder about the analysis of any possible disproportionality in the use of force.
Yes, we were not a part of that.
Yeah, you seem to say that you didn't know whether people who were stopped were resident or not, but isn't it normal for the police to run driver's licenses when they stop someone, and so wouldn't that information be available?
So that information could be available, but here's what happens, right? Every time I stop you, I'm not necessarily running your license, necessarily, right? And if I'm giving you a summons, I can give you a summons, but it doesn't mean the car is registered to you. You could be a visitor. There's all sorts of variations and combinations. Additionally, if I'm giving you a warning, I may just take a look at your license. Your license could say that you're a resident. It could also say that you live somewhere else. If you flip the license over and it has the sticky on it, it's because you've changed your address. So there are all sorts of other things that would impact that. And so that's not necessarily the strongest indicator, along with the fact that you don't get to ask people are their residents. Because then that would presuppose that you're disproportionately treating non-residents differently than residents. So you got to be fair and ethical. So that's why we didn't look at that. But we also wanted to raise it because people are asking that question, which is a fair question to ask. But the hope and the gold standard is that everybody gets treated fairly. There's a hand on this side of the room. You're not treating this side of the room very well, Councilwoman.
All right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Just to add on to the previous question, I think as a community we're struggling with police disparity more broadly, and I was wondering how you came to analyzing traffic stops in particular, and whether that was directly from the town or you decided that was the best data set, or kind of where that came from.
Great question. So yes, we were brought in to specifically look at traffic stops. And so I built the team out based on the request that was made of us. We were asked that we would look at traffic stops disparity, were people of color being treated differentially when they were being stopped, ticketed, and or warned. We had several meetings with the town representatives as well as law enforcement, and we talked about what kind of data we needed to collect, what we thought we needed to collect to achieve the objective. And we got that. When we didn't have that, we asked for more things. And as we needed more things, we asked, and the town responded. So that was specifically what we were brought in to look at. There's a hand over here.
And this does feed over that question, because I was under the impression, and I think I'm not the only one, that this report was also going to look at street stops. That was actually what was told to the community at one point, and I believe it might have been from council that we were told that you were also going to look at street stops. So that might not be a question for you, because you just said that you were only asked to do traffic stops, so I would like someone to be able to address that question.
So I'll address only the piece that I can recall. So I do know that in earlier discussions, conversation was around street stops, but I can also say that I don't believe there was a mechanism that captures it, right? So that's the challenge, right? So for example, in my agency, we capture street stops. So we have a field interview report that actually goes in the computer, captures it, and it shows up under the same date in the same system that captures all the other data. So when we began to look at it, unless I know something different, but my understanding after the dialogue was that we had no way of pulling it out.
Okay, so then my fall out of then. I know this did not relate to your findings, but could that then be a recommendation? What would you recommend to this department in this borough to help them make sure they can capture that data? Is there a system they should be using that you could recommend as well?
So I do know that we have a colleague of ours who I know is a mentor chief that's here, and I know that there are recommendations being made, so I don't want to step out of my lane and over to the other side of the fence, but I know that those are some of the things that they're addressing and looking at. So thank you. I think those are fair questions, and I think those are some things that they're looking at, so out of respect for them, I don't want to step into that lane, but I know that they're going to do a presentation after me and talk about what their vision is and what they've done and what they're doing and what they're going to do relative to some of that. So great question. There was a hand back here, nice lady on the left.
I wanted to follow up on the piece about the 25% of the data not being. My guess is that there is a plan in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again, like that the data is. So I'd like to hear about that plan. And then the other one is, I appreciated the recommendation in the report about the need for ongoing data analysis. And I think that that has to include more than traffic stops, as others have discussed. And I also think it needs to be someone who is a statistician or has expertise in data analysis. So maybe we're going to hear about that, but I think that's a plan that we really would love to know about and in detail.
Yeah, so I think you're right on point. I mean, one of the recommendations that I said that I didn't post here, that we recommended a statistician, because so I sit on the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative local committee for Union County, and each county has one. And that's under the juvenile justice system. I couldn't think of these agencies, right? Under juvenile justice system. And each county has a statistician assigned just for that. And so we're able to talk about length of stay in terms of children that are in custody. We're talking about beds, how many kids are going to court, how many people are being released, who's on parole, who has parole violations. So there are systems that do that. And so that is one of the recommendations that we made in the report. And I know that the township, the borough, has been receptive to the recommendations. So go ahead, please. Look, I'm here all year. Go ahead.
The question was related to license, the license reading that you talked about, how some...
License plate reading,
yes. Exactly. So I think that that would be something that really needed to be included in the data analysis as well, because I think it matters whether or not you have to pull over someone as to whether or not you're just pulling, like that data, there's been no analysis related to that kind of data. And I think that would be helpful and informative.
And I think you're right. I think that one of the beautiful things about the system being digital is that you can pay for all sorts of pull downs and buttons to push and things that you can check off that capture that, right? So for example, we can capture who stopped on the street, who stopped walking, give me a field interview report, why did you stop the person, what's the race of the person, what was the probable cause, what was the reasonable suspicion, right? Because you just can't randomly stop people because you don't like them. You have to have, at the very minimum, a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed, about to be committed, or probable cause. And so all of that can be captured. I mean, those aren't big things when you're digital. They're major things when you're on paper. I want to say that, right? Because I'm a retired cop. I had cops under my command. Cops, generally speaking, don't want to do a lot of paperwork, right? So guess what would happen if there was a drunk driver? Beginning of the tour, everybody wants it because if it's the wintertime, it takes you off the streets and you got 4 hours inside. If it's near the end of your tour and you got an hour to go, hey, can you give that to somebody else or just don't let them get crashed up until I get out the area, right? And so we're dealing with humans also and human motivation. So I think those are hard things to do, but once the borough has the system that I know that they've begun to put in place and they're looking at it, and I know that, I don't want to go too far, the things that the new chief and captain and his team are going to do and want to do, I think a lot of your concerns are going to be addressed. I believe that. Over here.
Hi. I have two questions. First is, can you remind me what the force report that the Star Ledger published, what data were they collecting?
I didn't go through their data, but they're using use of force. So when you use force down in New Jersey, you have to record it on a form, and you have to report it out.
So any stop, it could be a motor.
Any use of force.
Yeah,
not stop.
but that could occur with a motor vehicle stop, or a pedestrian stop, or I don't know, going to someone's house.
It could occur anytime a police officer encounters a human and they use force, whether it's mechanical force, whether it's their weapon, whether it's their hands. At any point, you have to document the use of force.
Okay, because in that report, Highland Park came out poorly at the bottom of the county. Okay.
Right.
And then you said a few minutes ago, you came here expecting that what you would find would be much worse than what you actually got. Can I ask what was the basis of that?
You want me to be honest or professional?
No, I want you to be honest and professional.
I'm an African-American male. I'm a black male in America.
Yeah.
I live this life every day of my life. And in my own community, I worry about how I'm going to get from point A to point B. And so that's my social reality all across the country. And so I come in with that bias, and it is a bias, but it's well grounded in my life, my lived experiences. So when I came, the first question I asked them when they met with me is, are y'all sure y'all want me? Like, did you hire the right guy? Am I the guy you want to come in here and take a look at your data? And Matt, who's I see in the back, Matt was one of the people at the table, they said yes. I said, okay, you got it. And I laughed all the way out, to be honest, because I was like, that was my bias that was speaking, but I was being honest about it.
Well, when I moved to this community in 1987, over the next decade, there were a lot of problems with the police force. And what I learned as a white person is that people of color did not want to drive through this town. And because I don't know what the statistics were, but their experience, their lived experience was that they were being stopped just from going from point A to point B. I think that that's still a perception. I've asked around, I don't know, I would imagine it's gotten better. But on the other hand, if that's still a perception and fewer people of color drive through Highland Park, and so you have a higher percentage of whites and a lower percentage, of a mix of out-of-towners and residents, that's going to skew your data also, right?
Very well may.
Yeah.
However, what I also recognize is that you have a new young chief, and you have a new young captain and lieutenants, and I would definitively tell you that they're committed to addressing that. And I think that's a great thing, right? And I don't say that lightly, because I'm usually the guy throwing the rocks at the building. So I'm excited about it. I'm excited what next year looks like. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Why in the world would I throw a rock at a building and it's not Halloween, right? So, no, really, I'm real comfortable, honestly, and confident that their approach to what's going on. I mean, and I say this because I didn't know them. Let's be honest about that, okay? Didn't know them at all. So I also had to come in and break the ice there, and they didn't know me. So here's a guy coming in that the borough says, well, you got to let him in, and you got to show him everything. So if I came to your house, you know where the cobwebs are, just like I know where they are in my house. And so for them to have to open that up and to be very transparent about it, I think it speaks to who they really are.
Okay, so that's good news.
No, that's very good
That they were
news.
very transparent
I
and
think your agency is very progressive at this point, yes.
I just want to add to that when I reached out to Dr. DeLacy, I went through, because I was fully aware what the problems are and the perception and everything else that's involved in that. And I reached out to the NAACP, and I said, I need someone who's gonna come in and no holds barred. And whatever the report is gonna be, that's what it is, because if we don't recognize our problem, we won't be able to fix it. And when I met with him the first time, I said this, and he says, are you sure that's what you're looking for? And I said, 100%. So I'm glad that he came in, he looked at it, and I believe we've gotten a true, honest description of where we are in Highland Park and what it is that we need to address.
Okay, gentlemen, right in front of you.
Thank you for the report. I think we already knew that the police department was acting in ridiculous racial bias when it came to use of force, but now we see that there's racial bias in terms of traffic stops as well, so thank you for that. My question is about your recommendations, and they're all very good. My question is there a reason you didn't recommend any systemic changes? So one of the demands made of the town has been for an independent civilian review board with actual power and an actual budget. Is there, and obviously the borough has failed to act on that. Is there a reason that you didn't recommend something like that? Because obviously when there is an incident of racial bias, what happens is that there's an internal review, the police investigate the police are found not guilty by the police, and nothing happens. So in terms of actual everyday people experiencing racial bias from the police department, even with the very good recommendations that you made, there's not going to be any tangible changes. So could you just speak on actual systemic changes that you would?
Sure. So thank you. First of all, I would tend to disagree with you in a couple of areas. One is, I believe that if you're looking at data, you're using data to drive decision making and to examine how you're behaving, that is a systemic change, especially if you're going from pen and paper, because I've worked in that environment. Because what happens when you're using a data-driven do policing, what you're also doing is something like CompStat, computer statistics, and you're holding people accountable based upon the statistics. So let me use Irvington. I don't want to use this agency because it's just starting. But in Irvington, for example, when I sat with them, they could identify right down to the officer who's writing the most tickets, what kind of tickets, what race of people are getting the tickets, when they're getting the tickets, and whether or not they're writing any other group. That's systemic, right? Because you're looking at the structure of your agency. You're looking at it all the way down to the individual, all the way up to the agency. And so one of the things that the director said to me is that, so when I look at these numbers on the board every day, and they have 5 people analyzing every day in that agency, and I live right next door to Irvington, so I can tell you that crime went from off the chain to, I walked the neighborhood 2 or 3 miles with no problem. So I was really impressed with what the mayor and police department have done. But what he's doing is, he's using that to drive how they make decisions, where they deploy officers, what kind of activities they deploy based upon what's coming up. So that is a systemic change, even if you don't see it as that.
In terms, yes.
In terms of, well, the system, right? The second thing, I was not brought in to talk about and to look at civilian review. But let me say this, having been one of the persons that spent the last 15 years driving to have civilian review board in New Haven, Connecticut, which we got this past January, after Malik Jones was shot and killed by the police at East Haven Police Office in New Haven, Connecticut. Civilian review boards are a hit or miss, right? I'm in Newark. I was part of the initial with Newark Civilian Review Board and oversight, and now we're there, but we're in court with the union. However, I think that they can be effective under certain circumstances. Certainly you talked about they need to have oversight in the context of having a budget that funds it appropriately, investigators that are properly trained, as well as subpoena power, right? But that's not the end all be all. I worked in East Orange 20 years, we had no civilian oversight. However, we had 15% of the children committing 85% of the crime, and police were not engaging young people in a meaningful way. 150 kids total involved in any programs with the police department. Got promoted, brought in, the guy says you got a lot of mouth, you talk a lot of trash, you got 2 weeks to put something in place. And so over a 3-year period, we developed Police Athletic League. We put together 33 community-based programs, raised $1.3 million, reduced juvenile crime by 33%, and we didn't have to put hands on anybody, right? I adopted 4 of those children legally in my own home and raised them with my mother. So there are approaches that we can use to change the dynamic of law enforcement and how it moves forward, and some of those conversations we've had. certainly, and I believe that you will see some change. Now, I don't live here, no question about it. I come through here, I pass through here, I'm over at Rutgers, I'm over in New Brunswick, and I'm also working in other communities. I know that I see Bruce Morgan in the back, NAACP, they brought me to town several times in New Brunswick. So I've been on both sides of this conversation, but I think that at the end of the day, one of the things that is important is that if we're hopeless, where are we going collectively? Right? And so, and I'm not giving a judgment one way or the other here, but I think that we've been in places, and I've been in places where we've implemented civilian review boards, and it's been very effective, and I've been places where it's been very ineffective. So, you know, it's 6 in one hand, half a dozen in another, and each community should decide how it wants to be policed. Thank you for that.
I just have one more question about something that you mentioned in the report, that 2,000, some odd number of 2,000 Latinx and Hispanic were not reported as such. And you mentioned, I think, reported as white.
Right.
And you mentioned that you wanted to understand whether or not implicit bias was the driving factor for the inclusion of Hispanic, Latinx motorists in the white motorist group.
Right.
And I was trying to understand how implicit bias would impact this type of reporting. So I was wondering if you could, because I remember reading that in the report, and I wanted a little to understand that a bit better.
Sure. So if someone, so let me start with the answer that I've come to know now versus what we thought when we wrote it. Okay? Because they're a little slightly different. So we raised that because that's something that jumped up. Why has that been done? What is the purpose? What is the reason? And was it a nefarious reason for it being done, as you might consider, right? What we learned is that in around 2000, someone in the law enforcement agency says, well, the census has now said that you can now classify as that Hispanic is an ethnicity, not a race. So therefore, we're no longer going to include Hispanic or Latino as a race. We're going to include it as an ethnicity, but we're putting them in with the white race. That's how that happened. And so that was my understanding in having that dialogue with multiple different people at different times around that here. Because I just asked using appreciative inquiry. So how did you record Hispanics? That's how I did it. And I didn't do it, I didn't come in with a pen. I just asked the question to several people who were in the position to know. And so then the dialogue came about. In 2000, the census changed this to this, and so then someone made this decision, that's how we're going to do it, because it's following the census, which is logical to me. Because this is not the only agency that has done it. Several agencies did that. The problem is now they have to undo what they did. So in terms of the bias, what happens, what makes it biased is that, so then when I'm looking at data to do an analysis, if I don't see Hispanics in the count, it means that you don't get included. You've been whited out, so to speak. That in and of itself is a bias, right? So I got Dr. Ortiz behind me, who's Dominican, right? So he's looking for himself in the count. And I didn't accidentally put him on the team. Aside from the work that we've done over the years, I brought him on because there was also the Latino community. After I talked to the committee, I was strategic in picking the teammates. Because I also understood the dynamic of the community from the different people that I talked to and that I knew from the community. I also brought some people that are here in the audience who drove through this town while they were in school at Rutgers. And so they absolutely had some of the view that the young lady over here talked about when they were here 5 and 10 years ago. So I had anecdotal information, so I had all of that swirling. And we wanted to try to consider all of those things, so that's why.
And will it be reported?
Will it be reported Hispanic in the future?
In the future,
Yes, that's my understanding.
Yes.
Yes, the chief has already made that. We pushed that button, and I think that's, and that was to the young lady all the way in the back that asked were there any things in terms of, not analyses, but there were recommendations and things that we talked about that we didn't write about. Because some of it was just, it was very organic, but we were having the dialogue. And what I was really doing was feeling out the leadership. To be honest, right? They know this now, but I didn't tell them. Just feeling them out. Are they going to be fair? Are they going to be honest? So for example, in the beginning I didn't know, and this was not to them because it wasn't their call. But in the beginning I was told there was one system. So that's what I went with. Now, as we were investigating, we found a second. Because I started asking, I said, well, what do you collect your ticket data in? And that's when we found out, but by that time there was a transition of the leadership. And I can tell you that Lieutenant Hamill, that has been the constant for me through both chiefs, the old chief and the new chief, was very consistent. He didn't hide anything. And when I got to meet the new chief and the new Captain Curbelo, they were very open. So I was like, oh, we're in the right direction here. And I really feel that way, and I would bet money on that, honestly. I've been in a lot of places. I said this when I first got here, I'm saying it a year and a half later, that I think that this is one of the more progressive places that I've been, black or white or brown. It really is very progressive, from your police department to your residents to your borough.
Thank you so much for the report, and thank you for your team also as well, and for being here tonight. And I kind of just I just had a strong reaction to the words that you were just saying, and part of it is because I think that people have been, a lot of this has come about because of experiences that people have had in the neighborhood. And as the community has spoken to leadership in this town, in the police department and in government, the reaction has been kind of exactly what you're saying. This is a progressive town. This doesn't happen here. We don't deal with these issues. We live in a bubble. We live in an ideal world. This is utopia. This is the message that we've been given. And what I hope comes out tonight from the work that you've done is that that is not true. While people might be forward-looking and progressive in their thinking, that doesn't change reality for us. How you feel in your heart does not change reality for us. This data is just a very tiny sliver of the reality. The fact that we have not looked at marijuana arrests, that we have not looked at pedestrian stops, the fact that we've had now 4 independent people, groups, analyze data on our town that have all come to the same conclusion, that our town is just like every town in America. We need to let that reality hit.
That's right.
And not just let it hit, but face it with real action.
That's right.
I'm not going to sit here tonight and pretend like this is we're in some golden paradise.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. What the data is showing is that it really pays to be white in this town. Why is it that you, being white, are at such an advantage that you can drive through town, and our town is making money, revenue, off the backs of people of color at a disproportionate rate? When you go to bed at night, ask yourself, why is that? And what can I do to make sure that our town is a more equitable place for all people?
That's right.
So please don't, while I appreciate all that you've done and said, and I appreciate the positive optimism, we also need to keep in mind that these are real lives
That's right.
of our brothers and sisters, our children, that are being affected. And it is not okay. And it is a crisis that needs to be addressed. Pronto.
Thank you.
Really small points in comparison, although I will say that just as one academic report writer to another, there's a really curious sentence toward the end of the report in the discussion, I believe, that directs the reader that the findings should not be used by either side to advance arguments. I have been on faculty since 2003, and I write reports on contract all the time. I'm really struck by that. It actually, to be honest, it led me to do an open request of the emails between your team and the city to see if you've been persuaded to put that in there. And it's why I asked about any additional analyses that were run that weren't included in the report. And I didn't find anything. And I'm sorry that I felt that sense of suspicion. I'm very grateful for your team, but I think what Sonia has just shared with us suggests also not only why there's that sense of suspicion, But it also relates to why there's probably the transparency that you experienced on your team, is that the borough deserves some degree of credit, but that transparency has come hard fought by more, by probably going on 2 years of community begging, demanding for a conversation and acknowledgement and then action. And so just to riff off of what Sonia just said, in the police department's notes, kind of advertisement on Facebook about this event, it was framed, I'm pretty sure, as an important start of a conversation or something. I'm closely paraphrasing. No, that is literally the last thing that we want to hear in the community. There have been really awful things that have gone down here and lots of work done to try to get a sense of the problem and identify it. And we're well ahead of the start of the conversation. Your report, I think, confirms what has long been known experientially in the community, but also through additional analysis that have been done. So what I am curious about, you talked about having a statistician, and I couldn't agree more. And I'm wondering if your firm is available on contract. I know you don't want to plug yourself, that's going to be a little tacky or dodgy, but obviously you know our town, you know the data now. You seem to be extremely well poised to serve in that role if we were to contract with you. So my first question is, one, would you be available for that conversation with the city, so that if we ask the city who they're going to use, we know for sure whether or not you would be available for that, and we can respond accordingly. The second is whether you consider the data cleaning you've done proprietary, or whether that clean data is now available, should there be people that would like to, I'm assuming it's de-identified, or could be made so as publicly available data, for being able to do the year-by-year trend analysis that you were unable to finish.
So let me say this as best I can, right? I'm not sure, because there's an agreement that we do have with the city or the borough, and I have not, and I'm not off the top of my head right now, I can't tell you what it says in that section about that. It's not our data, it does belong to the borough. So let me say that, so I can't answer the borough. So my answer, well, yes, but my answer is I don't have that answer today, because I would have to open up the contract and take a look, so I'm not sure, is a short answer. The other thing is that, no, I mean, and it's okay that you're open, right? Because it's a very, my interaction with the borough has been very clear and very straightforward. I can be very honest in saying they didn't ask anything of me in that regard. I'm old school. So let me say this, because I think it's helpful. I'm the founder of Black Cops Against Police Brutality since 1991, so that's been the work that I've done around the country. So that was why I asked the question that I asked, because I knew they would know that. And I'm like, are you sure I'm the guy? Because I'm hell raising all the time, right? I know that Bruce and others from the NAACPs in this area recommended me. I'm also an NAACP member. And the reason I'm a member is because I'm very critical of the NAACP, right? So I joined them so I could argue with them, and I've done that for the last 10 years. So I'm just being very honest. I mean, I've got a handful of friends. The president in Long Branch is my friend. Lorenzo is one of my buddies. We protested all over the state, Kingsburg, particularly around the police chief, referring to African Americans as the ends. So I'm from that perspective. But I also, as an academician, want to take a clean set of eyes, right? So I think your point is well taken. I don't disagree with you, which is why we also wanted to come in, right? We wanted to come in and say, hey, we're going to look at it fairly, and it's going to be what it's going to be. No one pressured me. I can tell you the 1 or 2 times that, and it's just being very transparent, when someone from the borough reached out, if they weren't from the committee with the councilwoman, which is where I started, or someone that they said I should have a conversation with, I refused to talk to them. And they'll tell you that I angered some people because they said, well, I had someone, I'm not talking to someone, I don't know so-and-so. I don't care who told you to call me, tell whoever told you to call me, for them to call me, because I know their voice on the phone, and I'll tell them everything. And they weren't asking for what I was doing, they simply wanted updates, right? Because we were getting close to a year, and I said we would have it done in a year, so they were trying to get, so of course people are busy, and we had election times come up and all of that, and so people wanted to have information. I'm like, no, I'm not going to talk to anybody, and I didn't. I just didn't. When I didn't talk to, this chief wasn't in at the time, but the other chief, when I went in, I talked directly to one lieutenant, Lieutenant Hamill. That was my point of contact all the time. When I came to the police department, I asked for him, I met with him, we sat down at the computer, and so I didn't delimit a lot of the data because it has names, and then when we didn't pull names, we didn't look at individual officers in terms of the report, but we got to see everything. And so I commend the community for fighting and for advocating. And that's why I said to the gentleman that asked me about civilian oversight, that communities have to decide how they want to be policed in their communities. And I respect that wholeheartedly. So thank you.
And yet,
So one, or two quick questions. Kind of building off the question we got before about specific recommendations. There are 4 specific recommendations at the end of the report. 3 of them are about data collection. The 4th one is for implicit bias training for members of the police department. My admittedly limited understanding of the data on that is that there isn't a long-term change in behavior that typically results from implicit bias training. It's highly dependent on the quality of the training, which obviously varies greatly. So of the studies that have been done, there's a lot of variation in the results, but on net, there's really very little of a result. So my question is that your understanding of the efficacy of implicit bias training in general? And second, are there any other recommendations that are perhaps more effective leading to long-term changes in behavior?
So, a couple of things, good question, right? So, in terms of data collection, in an agency, any agency, so one of the conversations we had yesterday with folks was around how do you change the culture of the police department? And how long does it take? And some of the questions that were asked of me was, well, we were told that from soup to nuts it could take anywhere from 5 to 7 years. Absolutely. So I was a part of making the change out of the chief's office in East Orange. So the data suggests, I mean, the studies and literature suggest, when you have the support of the leadership at the top, it takes about 5 to 7 years to change the culture of a law enforcement agency. Without the support, it could take you 20 to 25. Now, having said that, and I was a part of that for 2 different states of police, and that's why I've said some of the things that I've said, because I'm looking specifically through that lens, walking through the door. And it usually occurs when you've made a change in leadership, because then you have the opportunity to also change the mindset of the officers that are working. You're correct relative to explicit bias training. It's only as good as the trainers, and it's not very effective if you get away from it and you don't implement anything that's been put in place in terms of your everyday activity. So for example, if you don't model the behavior, if you don't utilize the strategies, if you don't employ it, you don't celebrate it, you don't tell everybody what we're doing, and we're doing it collectively, you're right, it's ineffective. However, we've also gone into towns, we just came back from Baltimore, Maryland, and to your point about fighting long and hard, we started with a People's Plan in 1998. It took until this past year to finally get an office of African-American males, something in the office, in the mayor's office, and we were invited down. But we've been fighting them since 1998. That's why I talk about progression, right? Because it's a battle. And they brought me down. We had a full weekend conference with the community groups, activist organizations, and talk about what that plan looks like going forward. So I think that that's one piece of the puzzle. The larger piece of the puzzle is about, so they use the term community policing, not as a program, but as a philosophy, right? Where you flatten the hierarchy and you're making decisions at a lower level and you're engaging the community. That's doable. And that's doable along with all the other pieces, and some of which I think are going to be presented this evening. Thank you.
Is there any additional questions for Dr. Lacey? Seeing that there's none, I'm going to thank you so much for coming down.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our Police Chief Abrams, and he is now going to share the work that they have been doing and the changes that they have been making within the police department, just to give you an update of the 2020 and beyond vision for the Highland Park Police Department under the new administration.
Hi, everybody. I want to start by thanking you all for being here.
Can you use a microphone? Thank you.
I want to thank you all for being. That's not right.
Yeah.
Test.
Yes. There you go.
Perfect. I want to thank you all for being here. I think it takes a lot of courage to come and support a community like this, and it's nice to see a lot of faces that I've seen around and had conversations with on these topics lately. I want to thank Dr. Davis for his report. It started before I was promoted. I was a lieutenant at the time. It's nice that it's come to fruition now, and I have the ability to make some changes and address the things that I see in my department and on that report. So let's get started. Reviewing the report, we picked a couple topics that we can use to implement the recommendations that are in there. I'm happy to say that the recommendations that are in the report that we got, all 4 of them, we had started ahead of time. We've also done more than those 4 recommendations. We're going to start with our training and go through these different topics, things we've been doing in our agency to accomplish these goals. As soon as I took over, I put a new emphasis on training. For a long time, training was second to everything else in police work in Highland Park. The town was gracious enough to drastically increase our training budget. We spread the training out amongst the entire force. It's not just a sergeant getting training or a lieutenant. It's our brand new officer all the way up to me, to the chief. And this will be posted online. I'm going to post this on the our website, so if you want to take pictures, feel free. But we are going to put this out there so everybody can get a copy of it online. By the end of this year, our 28 officers and 5 dispatchers will have attended 3,169 hours of training. And this covers all topics. Notably, when Captain Curbelo and I first took over, we took 4 other officers with us to the Noble Conference in Atlantic City, Regional Conference. Noble is a national organization of black law enforcement executives. It was a sergeant, captain, myself, and 3 officers. We spread it out amongst the whole department so everybody had a chance. At that training, we met our mentor, and these are the topics here that we actually covered in different lectures and drop-in sessions in addition to the actual conference. It was a unique experience, learning surrounded by black officers from New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and there's the 6 Highland Park officers there. It was refreshing to hear them talk to us and how thankful they were that we were there representing our agency. And the things that they shared with us were pretty eye-opening for perspective of African American and African American police officers. Additionally, we've done implicit bias training, case law. Is this annoying?
No, the podium.
Implicit bias, case law, professionalism, diversity, internal affairs, and active supervision.
Chief, are you using the podium? Because if you could move that out of the way, that would...
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, that's
All right,
great.
cool.
Thank you.
So these are just some of the notable trainings we've done. We've also done some pretty droll things, report writing, traffic reconstruction, things that officers need to use every day to maintain safety in the community and our interaction with our residents. But we put a big focus on a lot of the training, department-wide for the most part, on training to impact our officers and their ability to address any implicit biases they may have and to help us better serve our entire borough population in a fair and equal manner. Policies. We haven't looked at our policies in 15 years. We have immediately started reviewing policies, rewriting, revamping, doing everything we need to do. We have policies that go back to the 70s. No beepers on your belt. Some stuff is really, really out there, but we've started doing it. It's a long process. There's a lot of policies. But we're taking each one in turn and we're working on them. We're also working on new policies. We've been working with the Equity Commission and the Immigration and Refugee Commission. Good dialogue back and forth with both groups. We finished with the Immigration and Refugee Commission the Immigration Trust Directive, which came from the AG's office. It has since been updated to version 2. We have to work on getting the second version out now. There's a couple of minor changes. And we've been working on our bias-free policing policy with the Equity Commission. We wrote it, we gave it to them, they gave us some comments and gave it back to us. I believe the Immigration and Refugee Commission has also looked at it, as well as some residents, and given us feedback, and now we're working on taking that feedback and implementing it in ways we can into that policy. Some of our policies, the input we get from the community is not stuff that we would think about as police officers. Sometimes we look at a problem on one side only. Being able to have the residents and the public come to us with, hey, look at this, look at that, think of it this way or that way, specifically with terms. For example, on the bias-free policing policy, we struggled with how to refer to the people in the town. Do we call them borough residents? Well, resident has a connotation. Do we use citizens? Well, what about undocumented people? So we had a real struggle back and forth, and we're going to go through that again and change it to make it just the people, just to cover everyone totally. That's some of the changes we're doing and some of the things we're doing as we work with these commissions. We're updating our racial profiling, which is for traffic stops, and our body-worn camera policy. we are creating our stop sheet policy. So a lot was talked about the 25% of the data that was lost. Right? For the longest time, we did all of our stop data on these pink sheets that you write the license plate, the case number, if a ticket was given, and then race, a checkbox for Hispanic, yes or no, and if a summons was issued. So they would then go from the pink sheet the officer completed to a records clerk who would try to input this manually into a database, which was archaic at best. We kept these reports as long as we needed to by state law, and then they were destroyed as they went through. Some of the data that was missing or lost was destroyed based on record retention times. You know, we only have so much room in archives, these records can go, not anticipating a study like this was gonna come along. Some of it was damaged. We had a pipe burst in our archives and we were doing our construction between the two buildings, and we did lose some records, and we had to have destruction orders for that too. We also switched from paper to digital. The switching of that, there was no check and balance when we did that about 4 years ago. We didn't continue to do the papers and check it against the digital, we just entered it digitally, and since the captain and I have taken over now, we've done it so that we do both. So we're looking for errors. The officers are still doing the paper copy that's turned in, everything is still getting digitally entered into the computer, and then we look at all the stops, we compare it to the stop data, and we make sure that everything's correct. We're finding now, at this point, in the beginning, we're finding 20, 25 errors a week. We're down to 1, if any, a week now. We're getting this data spit out to us every week. So we think we've licked the data retention problem and the data accuracy issue. There's certain things we can't do. Hispanic can be hard sometimes. There can be a person of color who's Hispanic, a person who looks more white that's Hispanic. It's not something we can ask. I can't walk up to a car and say, oh, by the way, are you also Hispanic? It's tricky. So some of it's up to officer interpretation. And that's just the way it is. But we're trying to streamline it the best way we can so everyone is represented. We've been talking about adding categories, like Dr. Davis said, adding in a Middle Eastern category, things of that nature. Maybe breaking out Asians from Indian Asian to the rest of Asia to get a better data on that, since we have such a large Indian population right over the border in Edison. So we're trying to experiment and see how we can best collect data to give us the best results so we can use the data in the best way possible. Our final goal ultimately is to become an accredited agency. To do that, we have a lot of work to do. It's a multi-year process, and it's going to be a lot of work, but I think it's worth it in the end, and that is one of our goals, one of the things that we had to talk a lot about during the promotional process, and that's where we wanted to get to. Transparency. This comes up all the time, and it's important. We're police officers. We work for the people. You should know what we're doing, within reason, for privacy issues, of course. But we need to be more transparent. In the past, that wasn't the case. I'm trying to change that. I'm trying to have these meetings. We're trying to put more information out on social media, more information out when the new website gets solidified and we have more room on there. We can put more information on our website. We're going to continue to track data, and that data is going to be made available on some kind of interval. We got to figure out how it's going to work to have the best numbers. If we have too little data, that doesn't give us a good information. If we have too much data, we waited too long. So we're still trying to track where that line is between useful data, where it's significant information that we've attained, and too long to fix a problem that's already started. And none of this has ever been done before by this agency, so we're starting from scratch here. You know, we're lucky I can reach out to other chiefs and other agencies, see how they do it, and get some advice. My mentor has been absolutely amazing in a lot of these categories, giving me great advice and different methods and contacts that I can reach out to. But it is a slow process, and I've said it at the last meeting, I said it at the first meeting, we're getting there. We're getting there. These open meetings, they're huge. Gives me a chance to see people, gives you a chance to see me and talk. I've had people come to my office when they've had questions or concerns. I've stopped and talked to people in parking lots, on the sidewalk. It's great, I love it. Spending most of my career on nights, I didn't get to do that a whole lot, but it's nice meeting more and more of the residents in town and getting to know them. Community outreach, this has been huge. When Captain Curbelo got promoted, he came out of our community policing program to be captain. We put Officer Brian O'Mara in there, and he's had some pretty good ideas for some of the outreach stuff. We are doing a trunk or treat event. It's on the agenda if you saw it. We're going to be posting it online. We hope everybody comes out and participates. We're going to have different borough entities there giving out candy and having costumes for the kids. Just another way for our officers to meet people, to, even though we don't live here, to become a part of the borough of Highland Park, to become a part of all of you. It's important. If we're going to police you, if we're going to take care of you, if we're going to protect you, if we're going to write you tickets, if we're going to arrest you, we should be part of you. And that's the best way we can figure out to get there. Encouraging closer ties between the officers and the public they serve. And social media, if you've noticed, we've been putting a lot more information out there, arrests that we've made for different crimes. We're doing the Breast Cancer Awareness Month. We all did donations and, pink patches. We've done as much as we can, we're putting out there. We want everybody to see what our officers are doing. We're putting out pictures now of the men and women in the department that work on overnights. So when you're sleeping and they're out on the roads and you don't get to meet them, you can see them online and at least know that they're there and know who they are. This is something that I truly believe in. If we reach out to the organizations in town, the people in town, the community leaders, and we hear what you're telling us is a problem, we can fix it. We can work together to solve any issues that are going on. If we never talk, we don't know there's a problem. You don't know that we care, and then nothing ever changes. We're trying to get to the point where things change. So Dr. Davis's whole report was data-driven. Right? In the past, we never looked at data. We did these stop sheets. Nobody ever really looked at them, other than to say, okay, I stopped some cars this week. Here's my sheet. Keep it in case I ever need it for trial. And that was pretty much the end of it. Since the captain and I have taken over, the captain specifically, he's been really crunching the numbers on this. We've gotten the computer programs to talk to each other. We're getting automatic reports weekly. We can compile that to monthly reports where we get to analyze stuff. And next couple slides, you'll see actually what we're doing with it. The traffic stop sheet, the enforcement details. We never recorded pedestrian encounter stops. If I stopped to talk to you, we never recorded what that was. We never recorded investigatory stops or things of that nature. We don't do them very often at all, but we did never record them. That's something we need to start doing. That's one more step we're taking in our data collection. We're monitoring arrest data, we're monitoring our traffic stops. Things like that have never been done before. We started a new way to review use of force. It's all new stuff to our department. It's a culture shift from the top down. New equipment. We purchased a traffic counter. We put it out for 1 week on Cedar Lane, and we put it out for 1 week on Route 27. We were curious, looking at all this data, how much traffic actually ran through the town on a weekly basis. It'll also pinpoint times where traffic is heaviest, which will help us with any enforcement. It'll put out fastest speed, lowest speed, average speed, so we know if there's areas that we need to target more. If we get complaints about speeding or bad drivers in certain areas, we can set this out and collect some data. On Cedar Lane in 1 week, we had almost 29,000 vehicles traveling only east to west, that's down the hill. In 1 week on Raritan Avenue, we put it at 2nd and Raritan, we had almost 97,000 vehicles coming through town in a week. That's important to us to know. It's not just people that live in Highland Park that are driving on our streets. It's people from all around the surrounding area. We're right across the river from the county seat, a major university, Johnson & Johnson, county courts, the registrar's building, all these things. A lot of people come through town to get to New Brunswick. It's an important stat we need to keep in mind. This is the report that it spits out for us. You'll be starting to see these a little bit on Facebook occasionally. This is what we're doing with the data. Every week, we get these data stop sheets for motor vehicle stops specifically right now. Monthly, they're going to get looked at. We're going to pick out outliers and look at them. Quarterly, we're going to look at all that data for race, unless there's an outlier. If there's an outlier, that person will have to dive on their data right away. And that's going to help us track what's going on. Once we find an outlier, these are the tools on the bottom that we can use to help us find out what is going on. Any written reports for any of the cases, body-worn camera footage, MVR footage, which is the camera in the motor vehicle, in the police car, that records the stop as well. And any records of any enforcement details collected. We ask our officers to go out to certain parts of town where we have complaints from residents for stop sign violations, speeding violations, things of that nature. And we ask them to do a selective enforcement detail in that area. Let people know why we're stopping them, that residents told us that this is a problem, and that's why we're out here, and make these stops. If these stops happen in different parts of town, it can give us a reason for why stop data might be skewed racially. if it's in a part of town that has a higher Asian population, a higher black population, we're going to get more drivers of that ethnicity or that race. And it's going to kind of help us pick out what's going on. Supervision. You saw on the slide on training, we sent all of our sergeants to supervisory training. In the past, we had sergeants that were primarily glorified patrol officers. We were a small town. We sometimes have 2 or 3 officers on the road, and the police officer that's acting as a sergeant would be out there answering calls, writing papers, not leaving them a whole lot of time to look at the data, to look at their officers' production, look at what they're working on, why they're working on it, how they're working on it. That's changing. More responsibility is given to supervisors from the top down, and then from the bottom up, they have a responsibility to bring any shortcomings, any problems, any issues back up to us so we can address it. Accountability and discipline, the stuff that we looked at before, that's going to help us keep our officers accountable. When we do research, when we go into their data, when we go into their body-worn camera stuff, if there's a problem, we can address it appropriately, following our rules and regs for discipline. Early intervention system, we have a program called the Guardian Tracker. Early warning flags were mandated by the AG. We bought this program called Guardian Tracker. Everything gets entered into it that an officer does. If they make 3 things out of a list of 14 different items that cover abuse of sick time, motor vehicle accident, IA complaints, it trips a flag and makes us look at their work production, makes us look at their record, makes us look at what's going on, look at their body-worn camera footage, and find out what is happening. It could be a sick time flag pops, so all right, they were sick, they whatever's going on in their life, and then it's a legitimate answer. Or there's a problem. They had 3 on-duty accidents at fault. What's happening? Are they not paying attention? Are they speeding? Are they talking on their phone while they're driving? Things like that. It'll trip a flag, and it points us at specific officers. We've been meeting regularly with Chief Sproul, the mentor. She's been giving us a lot of guidance on how to do some of these things and how to go forward, and how to address some of the shortcomings we found and how we've done things in the past. So the report that we got from Dr. Davis had 4 recommendations, and there's 2 on the left. The next slide will have the next 2. Bless you. I'm happy to say that the things that he asked us to implement, we started doing before the report was released to us. A lot of it was data-driven, and we looked at the data and said, the way that the captain and I can keep track of what's going on in the department is data. If we have this data, we can look at it and try to figure out what's going on, and we can do something meaningful with it. It's also a way to be transparent and a way for data that's appropriate to be released can be released, and the community can look at it as well. So the algorithm to create the results from removal competent forces, that was before the change in administration here. That was under the old chief, but it's something we've been able to use to great effect because it's giving us this weekly report now. We haven't created a data analyst position yet. That's something we have to talk to the borough about and see what lies ahead in the future as far as staffing and things of that nature. In the meantime, we're taking the numbers that we get and we're crunching and we're looking for outliers. It's not fancy, it's not elegant, but it works for our small sample size. We have 16 officers in patrol. You get too fancy and you're going to get data that just doesn't give you anything meaningful. You're going to get such a spread between officers that you might not get appropriate information to make good decisions. This way, by looking at outliers, we're picking out more people that are off the mean, off the average. Within a certain level, and we can pick out who's writing a lot of tickets, who's writing too few tickets, and then once that happens, we can look at what they're writing and see where we go from there. We can look at the racial data from their tickets and their traffic stops at that point. So Dr. Davis recommended a future study of traffic stop data. Absolutely, that's going to happen. This isn't going to stop because Dr. Davis gave us a report. This started before we got the report. It's going to continue after. We're going to find better ways to use this information. We're going to find ways to collect similar data for other call types as we go forward. We're going to try to expand this bigger and better. The captain and I have been in for 6 months. We've made huge strides. We've learned a lot. We've made a couple mistakes. We fixed them. We drove on. And we're getting better data and better information to guide the department forward as we go. Finally, the implicit and explicit bias training, that's already in that 3,169 hours of training that we've done. It's actually scheduled for December for the whole department. Some of the other ones have been done already. but it's there. It's also not going to be a one and done thing. It's going to be a continued training. It's not going to be, oh, we did it, check off the box, we don't ever have to do it again. It's not how it's going to be. It's going to be continued training. It's going to be different training, different instructors, different classes, different locations. Trying to keep it so that you get a broader experience from different people who are teaching these topics. That gives our officers a better baseline to draw from when they're interacting with the public. So going forward, we're going to continue to track the data. We're going to act on what the data reveals to us. We're going to create benchmarks. This report is the start of the benchmarks for us. We've never done anything like this before. This is where we're starting. We're going to use that benchmark to measure improvement or failure. We're going to go forward and look at what Dr. Davis came up with and look at how we're doing and see if we're improving or not. If not, we're going to address it and try to find out what the root of the problem is and make sure we can fix it. Continued interaction with the public. These kind of meetings are still going to happen. They're not going to go away anytime soon. We're still going to be approachable on Facebook. We're still going to be here. Come see us, come talk to us if you need to. We're available, we're approachable. If we have the time to talk to you, we will. Reports, we're going to start getting more of the reports out to the public. Right now, the stuff we're putting out is on Facebook. When the borough website is done, we have a section for the police department that has this information. That's going to start getting out to the public too. You're going to see some of the data we're collecting and the results we're drawing from it. Training, as I said, is going to continue. We're going to continue to work with borough commissions and committees. We're continuing to grow our department. At this time, 40% of our patrol officers were hired after the start of the data that Dr. DeLacy used to do his study. Since 2012, we have a 50% entirely new department. We're constantly hiring. We're constantly trying to diversify our department. We're trying to make our department better, bringing in younger people with new policing methods from new academy classes. That, you know, some of this stuff now is being taught. The community policing, the data-driven approach, implicit bias, that stuff's all taught in the academy now. We had cultural diversity for like 4 hours when I went to the academy, and that was pretty much it. So things are changing at the academy level, and as we're bringing in new officers, we're getting an officer that is more community-driven, that is more aware of implicit biases, that is more aware of other cultures and how to interact with them in a respectful manner. And that's been a huge plus. In fact, some of our newer officers are almost like role models of some of our more senior people when they see how they can interact with somebody and keep things at a calm level and treat them a little bit differently than maybe a more seasoned officer that's got 20-something years on would have. So if you have any recommendations, when I'm done here, I'm going to answer some questions if you have them on this. And then when that's done, I have a couple things I just want to talk about, just Highland Park borough-wide stuff. My phone number and my email address, Captain Curbelo's phone number and email address. Please follow us on our social media Facebook page. That's where we get a lot of information out there. Everything from a water main break in front of Pino's the other day to an arrest for a package theft to you know, the upcoming trunk or treat community event we're going to do. It's all on there. So if you have Facebook, if you have the ability to do it, please look at it. Other than that, we try to put stuff on our borough Facebook, borough website page, but that's it's in flux right now as we're developing the new system. That's it for what I have for that. Now, is there any questions about what we talked about? Yes, sir.
I want to thank you very much for how thorough and carefully you've gone through this. I guess the question I had was this one, which is, with the data you got back in the report indicating that people of color are being disproportionately stopped, people of white are being disproportionately unstopped, let's say, what would be the 2 or 3 main factors in your mind that are driving that disproportion? So, because that's clearly what you want to hone in on in all the solutions you're offering. Are there 2 or 3 that you're saying, this is what we think is primarily accounting for that disproportion?
At this point, we've had the report for just a little while. We're still trying to track that down. I mean, the go-to answers are implicit bias. The go-to answers are, you know, there's more people driving through town than we think. So we're trying to take an approach where it's going to look at everything. We're trying to address the implicit bias problem with training. We're trying to address it with awareness, letting officers know, listen, you're going to have some preconceived notions of whomever, whatever. That's okay that you have them. If you don't act on them, you have to know that they're there, and then recognize it. So you recognize when your behavior is a certain way that That's what's driving it, and not the honest, truthful police job we're supposed to be doing. Like I said, we're still trying to figure out all that stuff. The report had a lot of data in it. We've had it for a little while, but not long enough to make complete heads or tails, to make a complete, this is absolutely the thing we have to do on it yet. We are taking small steps and seeing how they work, and then we go, this unfortunately is a problem we can solve overnight, or the, unfortunately snap of our fingers. It's going to take us some time to get there.
I just had a question. I don't know if but your recommendations, Dr. Davis has any recommendations, or and I'm wondering if there's any information on this, but because our population, because people of color are the minority in our population, it's a little different, obviously, than dealing with this in, let's say, other, like a city that we have. So that's a challenge, right? So, most of this room is white people, and we have sort of the privilege that we can get up here and say what we want, because we're not experiencing it. I know we have other folks that maybe have experienced it, but I guess two parts to that. How do you let the minority population in our town feel comfortable to know about these events, to feel comfortable to come to these events, to reach out to them? I think that must be a challenge, so I'm somewhat a comment question. I don't know if Facebook is totally the answer, right? Because it's funny, I was telling some people about the meeting tonight, and they didn't know about it, and someone said, well, I don't want to get known as a troublemaker. These are people of color. So, I think that's a challenge that you'll have to, obviously face in a community that's primarily not people of color, and how people of color can feel comfortable and not feel like it'll affect them worse to come talk. So I don't know the answer. I just kind of wanted to bring it up as something that we should see as a challenge that we can try to overcome in our populations.
That's absolutely something we struggle with, and I don't know what the answer is either. What we're doing so far is trying to bring people of color into the conversation. Bruce Morgan. I see some other people that are in town that I know that I've spoken to that are of color, and if they can get the word out, if they can get out there and talk to the fellow people in their community to come to these things, that's, I think, the best way. We do have Facebook, we do put it on the website, but you're right, that's not a great, I don't have Facebook, so I wouldn't see it if it was on Facebook. I would see it if it was just on the borough webpage, but it's a struggle, and I don't know what the answer is. The best thing I can do is to reach out and try to get.
The only thing I was thinking is if you had a set meeting where you said, twice a year we're going to discuss the issue of
right. So we're trying to do these quarterly. This is the third one. The captain and I have been here for 6 months. We're still trying to settle into the groove of how these things go. The prior chief didn't do these kind of meetings, didn't have this kind of interaction with the public. So it's new ground for us. Having scheduled in advance is great. Right now, we're kind of flying some of these by the seat of our pants to try to get the dates and times and when we can do it. But as we go forward, the goal is to have 4 a year. One in January, one in March, one in the summer, one in the fall, and then back to January again. And if we can get into a rhythm, and over the course of the next year or two, then that'll absolutely be something that happens. So right now, it's brand new, catch as catch can, and we kind of get the notice out there when we can do it, and try to get people here.
I'll touch a little on that as well. I think it has a lot to do with how our officers communicate and interact with our community. I know a lot of residents here by first name because of the way that when I wasn't a captain, I was a patrolman on the road. I interacted with people. I can point out residents, whether I've known Monique before I was promoted, or Bruce, or Tina that I see sitting there. I've known these residents because of the way that I interacted with people. I think that is a big thing. I think we have to, it starts at the top. We have to tell our officers, go out there, talk to the residents, talk to people. It's not just about arresting people or anything like that. So go out there and be friends with residents. Bruce Morgan's a friend of mine. I think that's very important. I think that's another thing that starts at the top with us is how we communicate on a day-to-day basis just with residents.
And I just want to jump in and say that one of the things that we did when we were looking at hiring new police officers, that community involvement or community policing was a really big thing, because one of the things we lack as government is that tool to effectively communicate with everyone. Yes, we have Nixle, we have Facebook, we put stuff out on the quarterly newsletter and we print materials, but we just don't seem to hit everyone. And we need to find a much more effective tool in which we can communicate so everyone gets the message about this meeting or any other thing that's going on in town. There's always a population that is missing from the table, and that's one of the things that we have to work on much better to make sure that everyone has a place at the table, so to speak.
Hi, good evening everybody. I have a call from very sorry. I did mention restorative practices to be established a few months ago for our community in general, for our adults community here, not children, adults. Because we have family situations, we have neighborhood situations, we have business on Main Street situations. How are we going to resolve it? Just keep it quiet, pretend nothing is going on? I would like we work for establishing restorative practices, and we can negotiate it with the schools, which is really successfully doing these restorative practices within the school. Thank you.
Thanks. I know we've spoken before about these practices and how they're already implemented for the youth. We try with adults, but we're also mandated by what the AG and the prosecutor's office tells us, and they guide us on what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. They give us a lot more leeway with the youth, not so much with adults. So if it's possible, we're looking into it, and it's something that we're constantly inquiring about and speaking to the prosecutor's office and the AG's office about it. But it is something that I know we've spoken about, and that is something that we're looking into.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There was a comment made that members of our community might be afraid to come to meetings like this for fear of retaliation. And I'm not sure, I think there's a response that you could have and should have. I deal
I'm all ears.
with retaliation for a living, and it's real. When people complain, when people are troublemakers, they fear and face retaliation. It's very real. I think it's important that from the top, the community and the police force get the message that the leadership of the police department won't tolerate that.
Yes.
That if there are people who come out, who speak out, who complain about the police department, that they're protected, that they won't be retaliated against, and that that's something that we encourage because we want to make this town work better.
You're 100% correct. To add to that, I just finished completing my internal affairs training, so I can oversee internal affairs. If anybody at any time feels that they're going to be retaliated against or they have any issues, I urge them to reach out to me. We will not stand for that. There is no tolerance for that at all. So absolutely, I agree 100%. There is no tolerance from the chief's office, my office, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm responding on the same issue, and there are just so many things about this coming up, and I thank you for asking that question. I think that yes, here we are in a room of majority white people, and a lot of the people of color that are here are kind of the same faces. And yeah, so people are wondering, oh, well, why aren't more people of color coming to these places? And I think that your point also is very important, and your response that we don't tolerate this. But again, this is the importance of having people of color in the room, because I'm telling you that it is tolerated. A report just demonstrated that it is tolerated that people of color are targeted disproportionately and unfairly in our town. If you want people of color to feel safe in this space, you need to treat them equitably in your policing. That's where you need to start. It's not about having a conversation. It's not about being friends with the people that show up to all the meetings. It is about demonstrating that any person, resident, non-resident, immigrant, non-immigrant, that comes through our town is treated fairly and equitably, and that the color of their skin is not a part of the way that they are, punished or retaliated against. So let's not sit in this room and pretend like, again, this town is treating people equitably. It is not. That's why people aren't here. Why would you show up to a place where you know that someone thinks of you as a threat? That every little move you make, and they have a gun and they have a right to, they can arrest you. Why would you put yourself willingly into that position? When you're white, you don't have to think about it, because you are given the benefit of the doubt, always. You are unthreatening unless you're doing something drastically. But let me tell you, there's a woman in this room who's brilliant, 18-year-old, not even 18, a child, was treated as if he was a criminal because he has black skin. Okay, so let's be clear about why people of color are not in this room. And again, what can be done about it is that policing is equitable. And I thank you for the work that you all are doing. It is a clear difference. And it is appreciated. And I'm not saying that this isn't, yes, this is all wonderful, the things that you're saying and promising, and there's hope in this room. Yes, a lot of hope. But let's not lose sight of what we're really dealing with. And not just what we're dealing with, but how each and every single one of us is contributing to a system of racism. Systemic racism, this is what it means. And we are all a part of it. And to dismantle it also takes all of us.
That's right. Thank you. I did also want to thank you, Chief Abrams, Captain Curbelo, for your leadership. And I know both of you. I know, obviously, Curbelo a lot longer, and I feel very comfortable and happy that you're in the position that you're in. But as we all have discussed, and Dr. DeLisi acknowledged, culture change has not already occurred in Highland Park. You are trying to instill that now, but we haven't gotten there yet. And I think the frustration that Sonia is expressing is that we know that as people of color. We know that. Because I can tell you, and the comment that I wanted to make had to do with the internal affairs complaint process, that it was not that long ago that I went through the process of having an internal affair complaint leaked within your department. And I was intimidated, actually intimidated, I won't say physically, but I was intimidated by a member of your police department. It happened, it's real. So yes, this is the kind of thing that we're experiencing right here in Highland Park. The same thing you hear about on TV, I experienced it myself with a police officer parking his car across the street from my house the same week that I filed my complaint. And I had never had a police car idling on my little block of Lincoln Avenue before. There's no speed racing going on my block. So you cannot tell me that that was not related to the fact that I had just filed my complaint form. And it also wasn't unrelated to the fact that a neighbor approached the one witness on my complaint, questioning her about her statement, because someone in your department leaked my complaint. And I'm putting it out there, not putting it on you, but I'm just keeping it real as to what real people are experiencing. And I'm the kind of crazy lady that'll come out blabbing my mouth about it, because I can't tolerate that. I'm not here to live in Highland Park. I didn't go through everything I went through in every other city and town I lived to come here and have my son get harassed or have my own family get harassed by police, because they're feeling like, whoa, wait a minute, she's talking too much, right? She's causing too much of a stir. This is a bubble, let's leave it alone. No, we have to simmer this pot. We have to stir because someone's gonna get hurt. And I know you don't want to hear me keep saying this, but we're on the same page. I do want to reiterate this whole thing about riding through Highland Park while black or person of color from another town. I know from people, my family, people who know Highland Park, people of color, if they're gonna ride through here, they're gonna go out of their way to drive under the speed limit. They're going to really be very careful. So as I listen to the numbers, I'm like, wow, even people who are gonna go through this town, unless they're some person who really doesn't know the area, they're gonna be super careful and they're still more likely to get pulled over. So the fact that there were fewer arrests, or a low number of arrests, which I agree, obviously that number was really low, also tells me you're pulling over all these people, but really for no reason. So it's clearly biased, right? You don't have an ample reason to arrest them, but they're still getting pulled over disproportionately. So bias is really a huge issue here. And I appreciate your commitment to it, but let's be honest that culture change has not occurred yet. It's gonna take a lot of years, and Mayor and I were just talking about what is it gonna take to bring people of color out. We're not fools. We know that things have not quite changed yet. So as the trust starts to build and people start to feel like there's some tangible proof that there's some change, then you're going to start to see some more people of color feeling comfortable to join us, the regular folks, and be here with us. Because we know when things start to change, we're impacted by it. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the internal affair complaint process, because this is, again, personally I was impacted by this. What are you actually going to do to make sure that there's more integrity around this internal affairs complaint process, and that people like myself aren't afraid to come forward and and issue these complaints? Also, with internal affairs complaint process, I reviewed the results of the complaints over the past few years, and I believe there was not one that was sustained. One complaint having to do with a charge of bias or racial misconduct on from a resident on to an officer. So that's quite suspicious, right? Given everything else we know about what the data shows, but yet not one officer was in any way found liable or culpable in those situations. So that tells us that there is some sort of a need for some kind of independent body that community members can feel comfortable going to and having their voices heard and having their concerns seriously addressed and not just brushed aside internally. So I did want to, I'm throwing a lot of things in there and I took some notes. My last thing is, with your data analysis and monitoring, you still focused on traffic stops, which is great, but I still didn't hear anything about the street stops, right? Like my son, his incident, and so there's been incidents that just happened here with other young black males in this town, very similar, and that needs to be in the data analysis as well. So how are we going to get that done?
First, let me say, the comments you made at the beginning and the comments that Sonia made, that's why we're here. We know we can't change it overnight. If we could, we would. I promise you we would. Nobody wants to have a police department or any person think that we are biased, that we do things not for the right reasons. None of us got into the job for these things, none of us. So the reason we're here tonight is to try to address the issue right at the beginning and the issue that Sonia spoke to twice, to Dr. Davis and to me. You're right, it's not changing immediately. It's gonna take time. We're hoping to build that trust by starting with this, starting with the data that we have already collected, the traffic stop data, moving through that into arrest data, field stop data, things like that, that some of it we never recorded before. So we're working towards that. It takes time to learn how the system works with the information we have now, what data is useful, not useful, what check boxes we need for different races, genders, time of day, what's important, and then build upon that step by step by step to get to the position where we can record these things and we can come out and tell you this is what's going on in our department, this is what's going on in our town, and be as transparent as possible with that. But it takes time, it takes a lot of work. So we're getting there. I want to just say that, and I'm going to turn over to Captain Curbelo for the IA stuff because he's head of IA now. But what was, you had the last thing you asked?
Yeah, can I just piggyback off of that comment?
Yeah.
And because I want to use this opportunity to really stress the importance of looking seriously into that recommendation that Dr. DeLacy made to actually hire someone to do this. It's a lot, I can
You're
see it's
sitting
a
next to the
lot.
right person.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, and if we really want to talk about being serious about doing this stuff, let's put our money where our mouths are, right, in terms of the borough, right? So, yeah, I'm glad to hear that there is an interest and a commitment to it.
Just let me ask one question before I forget, since you brought it up. I had to send you an email already on this, but Dr. Davis, you said something about the county having a statistician.
Correct.
Do you happen to know if Middlesex County does?
Yes, we do.
I'm certain Middlesex
We
County
went over that
has
last night.
Yes.
Yeah, we
They
did.
do.
Okay.
Yeah, because, I mean, gosh.
That's just for juvenile justice sessions.
So we have to make sure we reach out to the county.
Okay, so I do hear there's a commitment from the borough to really put the money that's needed into having someone come in and do that task with you, alongside you, or take
That would
charge
be-
of it.
That would be great,
as-
because frankly, we're overwhelmed with a lot of this stuff, and it'd be nice, it'd be a good resource.
Well, especially
And it
now
would
that
be
we have our
fresh
data
eyes.
systems.
Working.
Right,
Yeah.
now that we're actually collecting the data, we
Yeah.
can have somebody come in and actually do something with it.
Yeah.
If we weren't collecting it, it'd be a wasted space.
Right.
So, what was the last thing you said? There was something I wanted to mention, it slipped my mind.
The IH and the.
No, it was after the
The stops, the street stops.
Oh, you were talking about the arrests in line with the traffic stops.
Oh, yeah,
So-
yes, yes.
So not every traffic stop ends.
Black boys that were just arrested or something like that?
Yeah, it was, there were a couple of things I threw in there, I'm sorry, but yes, so I was talking about the street stops still happening with young black men in this town being stopped and treated as if they don't belong here, when either they live here or go to school here, and live nearby, and are very rooted in the community, just happened recently. And so, again, I just, it's very frustrating to know that as well-intended as you two are, there are still officers on the street who feel like, and because we have burglaries going on, if they see a black kid or black person, they're gonna be stopped. And it's not equal treatment, it's not equitable treatment at all. This has to be talked about. Like, do you have conversations about this internally? That when this happens, there needs to be some serious, like, we've gotta deal with this. This is not tolerable.
All right, I'll touch on two things here. In regards to the recent incident that you're referencing, the only reason I'll reference it is it is on social media, so that one we wouldn't consider a street stop because we were actually called to that. And I know we've been having these conversations at these meetings about the type of suspicious person calls we receive. Again, if somebody calls in a suspicious person, we can't say we're not responding. So we still have to go there and investigate and along those lines. In regards to street stops, there's a difference between, we don't do anything what New York does with the stop and frisk. The only time we stop individuals is if we're doing an investigation, in which a case would be created and everything like that. So there would be no, just walking up to somebody randomly and saying, hey, let me talk to you, let me get your information or anything like that. But it is something that if our officers do some type of stop like that, we do keep information on that now, since we've taken over. Again, that's since April. And again, like all this data was, again, before we were, able to implement these changes. In regards to IEA, I just finished a class last week, and I've met with the captain from the state police in regards to their internal affairs and their consent decree, and met with them and trying to figure out how we can improve what we do here. Also, meeting with individuals from the AG's office and how we can do things. I can't talk to what you're, and I know me and you've had private conversations and conversations off the record about that, but the only thing I can do is tell you if I'm in charge and that happens, there's no, I'm not standing for that. That's not happening. I wasn't in charge when that happened. I was just a sergeant. The only thing I can do is tell you to come to me, have somebody else come to me. Again, anybody can report an internal affairs complaint. It could be anonymous. It could be phone call, walk-in, any time of the day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a week. And we will do that. We also spoke with the Equity Commission that if somebody wanted to go to them and have them make the complaint to us, so there could be a third party, as long as they were willing to give that information. As a contact, we would do that as well. But that is all stuff that, since April, that we are addressing. And, you know, again, I'm sorry that happened to you. But if that happens under while I'm in charge, you come talk.
I want to come back to the calls that you just mentioned, and I just find it really hard to believe that there's absolutely, like, any call you get, you have to do something. So I thought it would be great, since we have Dr. DeLacy here too, that he could maybe tell us, maybe he has information on what kinds of policies could be considered regarding these calls. I've also seen in the news recently that certain communities have actually made it like much more difficult and have kind of some negative impact on people who are making these calls. And so I just don't think that our answer, we have to receive those calls, is an acceptable one. And so, like, what policies can be put in place? Police don't have to respond to all of these calls if no behavior occurs that would merit police involvement. So I think we need to have that discussion too, because the police don't have to respond to all those calls. It's been seen across the nation. We've seen that in the news, those kind of policies being put in place.
So when I mean response to those calls, in specific to the call that we're talking about, we received a call in regards to somebody being in a backyard.
I'm not talking about that call. But
No, that's what I'm specifically referencing. If somebody calls us and says there is somebody in my neighbor's backyard who I've never seen before and they're going through their stuff, we can't say, okay, we're not going to be there. Yes, if somebody calls up and says, there is an individual walking down the street I've never seen before and he looks suspicious, our dispatchers will ask, why does he look suspicious? Well, I don't understand. And so then we don't respond to those calls.
that's not true though, because we've looked at suspicious
Yes.
person reports where people are going out because someone is doing jumping jacks. A black man is doing jumping
Correct.
jacks. Like, that is not, what you're saying is not true.
And I know what you're referencing because I gave you the data and we've met and talked about it. That was prior to us. I can't speak to what prior administrations allowed. We are not allowing that. That changes now. You won't see that now. So, and I know because we've sat down and gone over the data and said, these are all the suspicious people calls from residents, and we see the high rate of why people are calling, and the response by the officers. We've changed the way our officers respond to that. So, yeah, and we've also changed the way our dispatchers ask questions. Our dispatchers didn't ask questions prior to, they would just dispatch. They wouldn't ask, well, why? What are they doing? What's unusual about it? That all occurs then.
But could that be put in policy? I mean, like, what if something happens to you? I mean, I'm sorry, just to say, like, you can't, like, if you're gone tomorrow, what's gonna, as a resident here, I wanna make sure that that stays. So you have to put in policy.
Yeah, you're 100% right. We're reviewing every single policy and rewriting every
So
single
if we
policy.
could add that to the list of a
Oh,
policy.
there's about 80 policies. There's about 80
So
policies.
there
We just
is
did it myself.
already a policy on how to respond on calls, and it's being revised, or you're creating one?
Some policies we're revising and reviewing, some policies we're creating, for example, the bias.
No, but
rule.
on this
specific
issue of calls,
Suspicious, we do not have a policy right now.
person,
That's
we
in
need
effect.
a so
You're right.
I am saying very clearly, we need a policy on how the police responds to calls of suspicious person.
You're correct.
I mean, for instance,
You're asking for suggestions, that is a suggestion.
Yes.
Yeah, you're absolutely
You're correct.
if you don't mind, for instance, a suspicious was, I guess, I'm assuming it's suspicious because I didn't know anything about this suspicious thing that's going on now in the park. But on my son, it was suspicious that he was parked his bike somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be parked. And the person came out to him as if he was stealing the bike, which is his own bike. And the guy grabbed him, and my son was begging. He said, no, this is my bike. And the guy was like, well, what are you doing with the bike? What you doing? Because, and I know this because he called me while it was going on. And that's what made me come out. Because I was like, hello, what's going on? And I heard the person go, what are you doing? He said, no, this is my bike. What are you talking? This is my bike. You're trying to make me say something I don't want to say. Well, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you here? So, and now he got called on, and the police took him in and everything, and then he didn't get charged for that, but they threw a charge on him for something like 2-3 weeks ago. You know, and then, so I'm just kind of, I'm sorry, but I'm just, this is new to me with this here, because I've been here for 15 years. All my kids was raised here. Everybody know my kids. You know what I mean? I am a good parent with my children, just me and my husband going through divorce, whatever it may be. But as far as, you know, my children, I'm there for them. No one ever called me. They were like, well, where do you live? What do you mean, where do we live? You know where we live. My son just graduated from here. When we were looking for him, he walks up and down the town all the time. What do you mean that you're looking for him? All you had to do was go to the Highland Park High School. Oh, we didn't know it was him. You know, I'm just livid right now. I don't know what to think, and it hurts me because, you know, this was our home. And, you know, and I told Jalen, I said, you would cross the bridge, you cannot come back because Highland Park isn't your home no more. And it hurts me. It hurts me. Because we've been here so long, I raised all my children, all the police officers. I never did anything wrong. They never, don't get me wrong, they children, some of my kids, you know, they had some issues. I ain't gonna say, you know, it's not nothing bad, but you know. But I mean, it's like almost I feel like they wait just until they turn 18. Now we don't need you no more. We can do what we want to do now. You know what I'm saying? And I don't know, I'm hurt. I'm real hurt right now because I feel like really I'm been slapped in the face. Not saying that they're telling me that they got one thing, but then I don't see another, you know? And then I yell at my son for doing something, then I realize that the guy, did detain him, you know, for no reason at all. And he didn't steal his own bike. That was his bike. You know what I'm saying? I don't know what happened then, but I know that particular day, that was his bike.
And people want to know why black people are getting rude.
So,
Can I just add something before you answer this? Because I think one issue, and this is something that is beyond it's related to your job, but you as police officers are burdened with dealing with implicit racism by people in the community, right?
Absolutely.
So, and you know, you're not tasked with changing the community, but you know, if there's implicit racism everywhere, how, you know, I don't know if you can get training on how to not deal with implicit racism by people that you're getting calls from. So because this is just, you know, we have racism in our community, and it's how, I don't know how you get trained to deal with that, so that people don't get,
all right,
that's what I'm just gonna ask.
Can I just add to this, because I was there for that incident.
Okay.
I live next door, I heard something going on, it was pretty awful. Jane was being treated very badly, and very unfair, I could hear what was happening, it was terrible. And by the other resident called the police. In fact, he grabbed him and wouldn't let him go. She had kids, please.
You're saying the resident did that, not the resident?
The resident did that, yeah. And I came out, and somebody else also came out from the building next door, heard the whole thing. And it was very alarming, and we understood something not good was happening to Jalen, and he was great, this young man, he really was. The police came, you know, immediately put Jalen in the police car. Did not ask for my information, did not ask for the other residents' information, nothing, they didn't care. We went down to the police station, right, to tell them what we had seen. You know, when Jalen was there, again, nobody really wanted to know who we were. Or could they contact us later for more information? Nothing, just didn't matter. And so I understand you're saying something about something else later on, earlier. But at the very least, somebody could have talked to us, because what we saw was pretty awful.
And I understand that, a couple things. Tina, I've known you for a long time, so I just want to, first, is it all right that, I don't want to talk about anything that you're not good with talking about. So a couple things. The first thing I'll touch on is the implicit bias of our own residents who call. I will give a short story that we've used before. A couple years ago, it's probably about 8 years ago, we were having a lot of burglaries on the north side during a specific time. So we started putting out officers on plain clothes walking around all the time. We only got calls when we put our black officer out there. And we got calls all the time. So much so that we had to take that officer and no longer let him walk up and down the street on the north side. So we understand it. We understand it. We have black officers, we have Hispanic officers. We definitely understand it. The chief and I agreed so much about when residents call and they're, that they can be fined. We just read an article recently the other day about that. I think it's in Seattle now, Oregon, that you can be fined if you're constantly calling. In that case, it was black males. There were people calling always on black males. That's more of an AG guideline thing, but it is something that we're aware of, and we're really training our dispatchers to ask those important questions about why are they suspicious. So that I'll touch on that. In regards to the situation that we're given, we're only given the information in regards to the call from what the caller is telling us. Side note to all this, I've known Jalen since he's a little kid. He has my phone number. He has my personal cell phone number, so I've known him for a very long time. I know her other kids very well as well.
And again, I'm going to ask you the question, why should black people come up here tonight?
He was arrested. He was
They
arrested.
said that he wasn't.
No, I'm just saying.
He absolutely
I'm
was.
just saying.
They never read his rights. They was
You don't have to, unless we interrogate
It's
you. We
not.
don't have to
My point is that the whole experience of it, of the interaction,
Sure.
regardless of if say he wasn't arrested,
They're lying.
say there was no arrest that happened.
For what we originally got called for, he was arrested for something else. What we were
Okay, so that's
told
what I'm
for.
saying. So
Correct.
he was, even if that didn't, so that specific incident, he was not arrested. But that still affects all of us in a very
Yes, you're fine.
troubling way. I think about, when I hear that story, I'm thinking about my son riding his bike around this neighborhood. And I'm trying to think of, how am I going to navigate this? How am I going to navigate this? How am I going to protect him from this type of situation? From not just the police, but the neighbors, which I've been saying from the get-go is the problem. So, it's like, again, it's a lot. It's a lot. And just to be in this room, like, when I lay my head down tonight, I'm not going to sleep peacefully, because I'm going to be thinking about all of this. And how are we going to solve this? How is my child going to grow up, his rest of his childhood in this town, and be safe? And I'm sitting here just thinking, like, I would, one of these days, like, imagine if all of a sudden the police decided you guys just decided you were going to search everybody in this room right now. No, I'm just saying, like, hypothetically. And how protected white people are. You could be, people are in here with joints in their pockets, this hippie pot-smoking town, and you're perfectly fine. You're totally fine. Nobody questions you. Nobody cares. But when you're black and you're riding your bike home, your neighbors will be calling the police on you. And you guys want to know where the black people are. Unbelievable. We have a lot of work to do, all of us.
All right.
I'm sorry, I'm looking again. Hello? Going back to the basics, I'm thinking that what I offered before, like restorative practices, even in these situations, in these cases, would be really helpful. It just has to be a different format comparing to like when they're doing restorative practices in school, so we can establish kind of restorative practices like that in a very narrow circle on an event when it's happened and people willing to participate and negotiate. So it's not going to go to the big and loud outcome. So that's why I'm thinking that to work on these things, negotiate, and to establish this kind of negotiation, and even anything or something happen, it would be very helpful. This is number one. Number two, my questions. Some people, we have a multicultural community and multi-language community here. In my case, we do speak Ukrainian language. What I have to do if I'm in a situation I need a translation? What services should I call?
For police services?
Yeah, for example, police been called,
Sure.
and some part of my family is Ukrainian, half of my family is African American. I'm talking about Ukrainians who need to be translated. What
Sure.
to do?
So there's a couple things that we could do for that. The first thing that we have is a county-wide list of officers throughout the county who speak different languages. And so we would utilize that list. And if that didn't work, we utilize a service called Language Line. And we would go about using a certified translator for us through what we call Language Line.
Mhm. I'll give you an example. We had a situation, we did call the language line with a situation, and it was police there. They did call language line. The dispatcher or assistant on a language online, he said that the translation services is closed for the night. It's impossible to get any translation right now, okay? And then, this is what the end of the situation. So please make your officer to equip with knowledge that 211 translation services do work 24/7. And please tell them to be available, because if we need to call police for translation again, I don't want to be in a situation that they would ask teenager when already situation been tense enough at late hours. I don't want to be seeing the situation again that the teenager has to translate. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll definitely look into that.
So, one of the main things we're hearing as far as specific actions that the department is trying to take right now has to do with data collection. And data collection is great. We should have more data. It should be available to the public generally. If it's basically legal, it should be available. But it's a big country, and we have a lot of data on what works and what doesn't work. So my question is, in this comprehensive policy review that's going on, have you identified specific policies, and not like, yeah, we're looking into it, or yeah, we're considering it, but have you identified specific policies that the data show nationally that reduce adverse outcomes like use of force, and you said these are policies we're going to implement? Again, not we're thinking about it, it's on the radar, but specific things like a mandatory de-escalation policy, for example. We know that works to decrease use of force without adverse outcomes as far as like an increased crime rate or something. So are there specific policies like that that you've identified that you're going to implement?
I know the policy you're talking about. So part of becoming accredited, which is our long-term goal, you have to revamp every policy up to national standards. And some of those are national standards. A policy like de-escalation is national standards. So that's where we're trying to get. So eventually, I don't want to get the timeline, but that's where we're going. Every single policy to be nationally recognized and being accredited. So it's every policy. I don't want to just tell you it's just use of force, because it's use of force plus everything to be accredited.
Well, right, but what specifically I'm asking is like going back to the force report at Highland Park, there's disproportionate uses of force among the Highland Park Police Department for whatever range of years are in those data. So what I'm asking is, are there specific policies that you are planning to implement to address that?
So, in regards to the use of force report, one of the first things that we did was go back and look at why things are the way they are. Some of the issues were data issues. The way we were collecting data was inappropriate. Also, when we used to do use of force reports, wasn't when we should have done it. The AG is, we were over-reported. The AG office says, they're hoping next year to have a universal use of force report for everybody to use. That's something obviously that we're going to use. I'll give you an example. The same issue that we had with Hispanics on the traffic stops. We were the only agency in New Jersey who didn't use of force on Hispanics because we didn't count Hispanics. So that has already been addressed, and that has been addressed since the day we've took over these positions. So in regards to reporting and how we do that, all those reports are done differently. They're monitored for the first time, and we're getting to the point where we want to be an accredited agency. So absolutely everything. And then part of the accreditation process is after all those policies are up to a federal standard, they're put online for everybody to read. And there's actually a community component where the community is actually solicited, not just in a meeting like this, where you can actually write in your suggestions, your changes, and everything like that. So absolutely.
So I'm sorry to harp on this.
No,
I want to be crystal clear here. So let's assume that the force report, because of the way Highland Park reported data compared to other jurisdictions, let's assume that disparity is actually an artifact of the data and it's not actually there. Even with that assumption, should it be a goal of the police department to minimize the use of force to whatever extent possible and still preserving, reasonable law enforcement outcomes? So even independent of the data, are there specific policies you intend to implement that would reduce use of force that have been shown to work in other jurisdictions?
I'll let the chief speak on the policy part, but I can speak on to the training part. We've now sent all of our officers to de-escalation training, which has never been done here in Highland Park, and it will be a continuous thing. It's not just a once in a year thing. But we will continue sending our officers there and other trainings that we find. I know I'm looking into, with the help of Monique, procedural justice and other implicit bias trainings as well as that. But I'll let the chief speak on the policy part.
So right now, the state AG's office has use of force policy that every department in the state follows. What it doesn't cover is the reporting, and that's where you get, like you're talking about, artifacts in the data from the definition on for example, the definition of the box for hands and fist. We had some officers that would use it if they had to punch somebody, and other officers use it if they just had to put their hands on somebody to put handcuffs on. Something like putting handcuffs on somebody is routine contact, it's not a use of force. But officers are doing a form, checking the box for hands, fists, because I put my hands on somebody. So we ran into a lot of issues like that. So the first step we need to do is to retrain everybody across the board in our agency on how to fill out these forms, what different things mean. We have annual use of force training with every officer we have to do. Since we've taken over, we've changed that. We put a review in place internally to look at use of force to make sure not only what the officer did was correct, but the way it was documented and recorded was also correct. And that's going to help us. The big problem is statewide. The form is not standardized. The information on the form is standardized, but the form itself is not. So people can do, in different agencies, all kinds of different things as they report things. Whether or not the person was in crisis or not, that plays a factor in how force is used and how force is recorded. EDPs, things of that nature, are different than somebody who's not the force is used on, and that has to be documented, recorded, so we can keep track of these things. For example, sometimes if I did CPR on somebody and I'm pushing on the ribs, I'm breaking them. Is that a use of force? No. If there is an EDP person who is in crisis and needs to be helped, emotionally disturbed person, and they're in crisis and they need assistance, and we're there to help them. And I have to hold them on a cot so that the EMT can put a soft restraint on their wrist so they can't get up and hurt themselves or a medic. Is that a use of force? It is, according to some of the way the stats are kept. So we run back and forth on how it's kept for different things. And it's not universal, and it needs to be streamlined. And hopefully, the AG takes care of this, and we get a universal way to do this across the board so everybody's apples to apples.
One second.
As far as policy, we're, like all the other policies, we're getting there, but it's the state policy that everybody follows. That comes down from the AG's office, and then we just take that and implement it as, scratch out state of New Jersey, right in Highland Park, and that's our policy. Because the officers are trained to a standard of language that's in that report. If we start changing things, now I have an officer trying to remember A versus B, how the report said it from the state level that they have to know versus how it's said in our local report. And in a split second, they have to reconcile these two different policies. So to make it streamlined, to make it less for an officer to remember in the heat of the moment, in crisis, it's just one policy that's straight through. Does that answer?
I guess so.
What are you still working on?
Well, so I guess, sorry to take up so much time, but the follow-up would be then, so is it legal in New Jersey for, like, for example, like there's a national emission standard and then California has a stricter emission standard. Is it legal for New Jersey to have one standard and Highland Park to say, okay, that's fine, but we want to implement a stricter use of force standard?
It can be. It's not as easy as just stroking a policy and putting my name on an issue with everybody. There's training involved. There's, we get our officers to the academy. They're trained to the state standard. The county comes out, does the training. We're trained to their standard. Then here, so it's not as easy as just that.
So my specific question is that kind of thing in consideration? And it sounds like right now the answer is no.
The answer is no right now.
Thank you.
Correct.
Just wanted to go back to the phone calls and people calling, and I think every time I come to one of these meetings, we have to go back and talk about this. And we continue to see this in their interactions and people going to Facebook. Like 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine posted that he was riding on his bike and he was followed and he made he's a black man. And his thing, like people were like, oh, I'm so sorry. He's like, this is what I deal with all the time. I just wanted to vent today. So it's not like since you took over or, the people are experiencing the same thing over and over. And I just wanted to say, I think Gina was here sort of pouring her heart out and saying so many things that I think Officer Curbelo, you were extremely dismissive, very trying to sort of defend and explain the situation. And I know we don't know a lot of the situation, but I have to say that both her and the neighbor were saying, like, when we went to the police and we tried to say this, those things weren't important because we were looking for him for something else. But what landed him there was a phone call, and how people responded to that and how he was treated is extremely important because that's what we're talking about here. And I think that just wanted to let you know that I thought the way you handle it right now was extremely dismissive, and it goes to show to the problem that we have. So just so you can reflect on it, and I think a lot of us were, I don't know, like that speaks for myself, I was very disheartened by your response. And I wanted to say that I just wanted to reiterate, and I was raising my hands when Sonia was reiterating too, that we really have to do better with the dispatcher training. We need policy.
He's jumping up and down and screaming, or he's laying in the street, or we get these calls all the time. Sometimes it's not true. Sometimes it's accurate, and we end up helping somebody who's in crisis, a diabetic slumped over in a car or on the sidewalk. Somebody trying to push in an air conditioner. Sometimes they're legit, sometimes they're not. So as officers wanting to help, we're always hesitant to not respond to a call for help from somebody. We have a hard time telling somebody that their feelings of personal safety being in jeopardy is invalid. It's a difficult line to walk, and like I said, we're gonna try to get there. It's gonna take time, it's gonna take work, and it's not gonna be solved. You're probably back here in a year, and we're gonna have the same conversation. It'll be better, but not perfect. And we can point to 6 times it happened this last 6 months instead of 12 times it happened the month before, but we just gotta keep working on it and keep plugging away at it. Yes, sir.
Going back to the incident of the young man and his bicycle, it struck me as it was described that if the person who made the call to the police restrained this young man, would that be a crime? I mean, that sounds at least arguably criminal to me as false arrest or assault or something like that, if he laid hands on this young man for having his own bike in his own possession.
The black kid ends up in the back of the car.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like...
Always.
Yeah, exactly.
I can talk about it as an abstract. I don't want to get into details.
Right, and I don't either, so it's an abstract question.
Right, so there's circumstances where that could be appropriate and could not be appropriate. I don't know the exact details of this case to tell you, yes, absolutely, we should go charge this guy or we shouldn't. I don't know. You know, the definition of assault is what it is. But there's variations made based on property, perception, reasonableness, things of that nature.
But I guess what I'm asking about is the young man got brought in the police car. This other person didn't get brought in a police car for restraining him for no legitimate reason. Why? How does it get decided who gets brought in this kind of situation?
If the person who committed the act did it knowing that it was illegitimately conceived to begin with, he knew that this wasn't this person's bike. He knew that this wasn't, he knew that it was his bike. He knew that it was his property, his house, whatever. That's one thing. But as a citizen, if you think you're doing good, barring severe injury, there's room for doubt there. And there's room where, you legitimately thought you were stopping a crime of progress. You legitimately thought you were stopping your neighbor's bike from being stolen or your bike from being stolen.
There's also room for white privilege to be at sway there too.
Right. Well, it's in a perfect world, it's taken on a case-by-case basis with the same factors applied across the board. And I can't say that didn't happen in this case. It very well might have. And next time there might be a similar instance with the roles reversed. One of the things I want to talk about tonight was the burglary arrests we've been making. We've arrested people of every color for these burglary arrests. We made 6 arrests in town. There's been 5 arrests related to the burglaries outside of town. They're still occurring. But we've arrested African Americans, we've arrested Hispanics, we've arrested whites, all for these break-ins. They were all treated the same way, they were all arrested the same way, they were all charged accordingly.
Right. I guess what I'm asking about is the question of assumption going in. And I hear what you're saying, and obviously I think we all agree that everybody should be treated equally, but as I hear that story unfold, and again, I'm hearing it told from one side, I'm not hearing the whole thing, but as I hear it unfold, there's a question to me about who should have been taken in here.
So that's part of the conversation we need to have. There's a lot of information out there about a lot of these cases that not everyone's privy to. There's privacy issues. The individuals are both adults. We can't go spreading around their business. But just because you observe something doesn't mean you know all the facts behind it. And there may or may not be other things at play. There may or not be other things that happened in the past that we are acting on. In each instance, not knowing the whole story, the totality of everything that occurred up to the moment of police interaction leaves a lot of room for, circumspect, sure, but at the same time, maybe what's happening is correct, maybe it isn't. Until everybody knows all the information, it's hard to make that judgment call.
Right.
And some of the stuff, I wish I could sit here and tell you story after story after story of different things, good and bad. But there's some of the stuff we can't go into at this point. Later on, some stuff will come out. You'll see stuff posted here or there once we're able to post things. But there's a timeline. What part of the process we're in before we can release certain information. Our Facebook page and eventually our website, and even trying to put stuff in the newspaper now when we're making arrests. That what the information is, so everybody gets now the full picture. Right now, you might not have it, but in a week you might. Hopefully that transparency will let you go, oh, okay, well that's why the 3 cops were there with this guy. Or, oh, that's why, this guy got yelled at, but the other guy got arrested. Hopefully that'll give you that kind of closure, but I can't guarantee you're always gonna get it. Some stuff, just, if you're not involved, you're not gonna know unless the person involved freely tells you. It's not our place to spread other people's business around. I don't think that's what I'm asking. No, it's not, but it goes to the perception of what I'm observing and what actually happened versus what I think happened. And it's something we fall prey to as well. We get on scene and we see something and we make up a decision or judgment until we can investigate, but we have the ability to ask those questions and get answers out of them sometimes, which gives us a chance to investigate. That's what our job is to do. Where sometimes the public wants to know things, and right now I can't tell you. You know, so.
You, one and one. Ira, he's gonna go.
I want to go back to I'll call it the white people's problem that we've been talking about, which is the neighborhood complaints. And you've explained that one thing you're doing, and this is not a problem you've created, but unfortunately it's a problem you have to deal with, and you have to help us fix. You talked about training dispatchers to ask certain kinds of questions. You said you've read about this happening all over the country. The department itself has experienced this for years. This is not a new problem.
Yeah.
This is a serious problem. At what point do you say the training of the dispatchers is not working? How do you measure that so that you figure out what the next step is? I mean, if we need to, I don't know how you retrain our community, but maybe that's something that the borough needs to take an initiative and do. I certainly have no expertise. I don't know how to do it. It sounds like you're not sure how to do it, but somebody's thinking about it.
Sure.
And
we need
and if the dispatcher retraining doesn't solve the problem, and I'm, you know, it'd be wonderful if it did, but nobody in this room thinks it will. It may reduce it somewhat, but you've described situations where the person calling just knows how to recycle their complaint to get the right answer. You need to deal with this. I'm sorry to say, you need to figure out how our community needs to be retrained, whether it be a sanction, but it's got to be on your radar screen, not just something that we discuss year after year, and come back to that same question and say, well, yeah, it's a problem, but we don't know what to do with it. It's an important problem that needs to be dealt with. So you need to say at a certain point, what we're doing is not good enough. Let's figure out what the next step is.
Absolutely. At this stage in the game, we're trying everything. Our first step is retraining our dispatchers. I don't know how we can make the community come in for mandatory training.
Well, maybe it means going out to the community with mandatory training.
Right.
I mean, we have churches, we have community groups, we have lots of places where the community lives.
Yes.
Where they can be told that this is a problem, that what you're doing is racist, that what you're doing exhibits prejudice, that, I don't know if that works either, but you gotta think about outside the box here, because inside the box hasn't worked.
Right.
So I know you've heard us talk about this before, but we did contract with the American Council on Diversity to do community training on implicit bias, and they want to start with us slowly, and they want to start with us, step one, which is going to be a meeting they want to have with community leaders, so to speak, and several people in this room have already been contacted about that, and I believe they're trying to schedule that first meeting for November. And from that point on, in 2020, they'll be working with us to do implicit bias training, or I can't really speak for them on what they want to call this, but it is going to be a program where they'll go into the community and work with residents to let them understand that, yes, we're talking about the police right now, but it's the calls from residents that are sending the police out, and that needs to be addressed. So yes, you know, the police can deal with better training of the dispatch people, and they are starting to do that with proper questioning of calls that come in, but our residents have to be trained as well.
I just wanted to ask the question, has the dispatch training happened?
It's ongoing, it's constant. It's something that...
Because we've been told it has happened. We were told about 6 months to maybe even a year ago that it had happened.
Right.
And so if it has happened, then it isn't effective. And I think that we need to consider why it's not effective. And I think the point that Sonia raised about having a policy is absolutely like a non-negotiable. There has to be a policy.
I agree.
And then I think the other thing, I just wanted to echo what Leticia said, that I think we've been asking, you know, why aren't people of color here? I agree that some of the responses tonight have been dismissive and have been defensive. And I know it's a difficult, I know that it's a difficult place for you to be answering these questions and responding in these moments, but it's not acceptable to respond in those ways. And it's one more deterrent to having people come who are being impacted by sharing their stories. And so I just really think that needs to be a point of reflection and a real way of thinking about how you can be less defensive and less dismissive. I just think it's really critical. I appreciate you doing these forums. I know they can't be easy to do. They really can't be. But that has to be something that's worked on.
Thank you for being here and for answering our questions. Not to belabor the point, but my comment is going to be similar to Leticia's as well. And then I'd like to ask a quick question for the chief. I think it's great that we saw that exchange happen right in front of our eyes, because I think it's a perfect illustration of what the problem is and why the solutions you're offering today are clearly woefully inadequate to solve the issue. So we saw two residents give eyewitness accounts of what is clearly misconduct by one of your officers, or two, I believe. And your response was immediately to circle the wagons, not address the allegations of misconduct against your officers, and instead to publicly out, essentially, the record of one of the residents of the town who you say you know personally. So, you know, this isn't new. Communities around the country have been struggling with these issues for years, and this is exactly the pattern we've seen around the country, right? There would be a shooting of an unarmed black person, and the police will immediately release their record to say, oh, but, you know, yes, we shot them, but they had a prior marijuana arrest. So obviously that the implication there is that much justified, right? So that's exactly what we saw tonight. You do right in front of our eyes in a forum where we're being told that the two young leaders of the police department have made a sea change in the department. So I think this is a perfect illustration of not only that, I'm sorry, but your assurances that you being in charge of internal affairs is going to solve the issue, that's not going to be enough, but also the fact that internal changes aren't going to be enough, and that there needs to be external systemic changes. So my question, very simply, is to go back to my question for Dr. Davis. If I'm understanding correctly, he said that if done correctly, if the Civilian Review Board or whatever it's called has powers of subpoena and has a budget and actual power, that can be effective in certain instances. So my question to you very simply is, will you commit today to support the creation of an independent outside, whether it's a Civilian Review Board or some other body, that has actual power to hold actual police officers to account for wrongdoing?
Right now, at this moment, no, I'm not ready to do that.
And why not?
That's a decision that's made above me. That's a decision that's made by people who are basically in charge of me. It's not helpful for me to say one way or the other. If that's what the town decides.
Why is that not helpful?
It's not up to me. My feelings in this instance, it doesn't matter. It comes to the people who oversee what I do, so the mayor and the council. That's up to them to make the decisions whether that's something that's appropriate for this town. I don't live here. I'm not elected to represent anyone here. I was appointed to this position. So it wouldn't be fair for me one way or the other to determine how this town should go forward.
So my follow-up, that's exactly right. So if the mayor and council finally decide that they will institute an external process to deal with police misconduct, will you commit that you will support the decision of the people who you say are above you?
My job is to work for this borough. This borough is represented by its elected officials. I do what they tell me to do to the level that they're allowed to. So if that's something that they come up with, and that's something they determine is appropriate, and they think it will help this borough and them being the elected officials of the people, then that's what we have to do.
Okay,
It doesn't matter what I want to do or not.
Right.
It matters that the people who are in charge of the town said, this is what we're doing. And then I have to figure out how to make that work with my department and with any board that's there.
Great, I'm very happy to hear that. So just as a follow-up to that, as other communities.
Further on that, because he's referring to us.
I think he's got one more question.
Yes, so, I'm sorry, just to finish up with the chief. So I'm very glad to hear that. So as other communities that have tried to implement this have seen, a lot of times the police union will fight any kind of external process. So again, once again, if the elected officials decide, right, but you are the chief.
Correct, but what the union does is separate from the rank and file police officers in the union. That's two totally separate things. I can support a decision, and I will support a decision if the borough council says we have to do it by policy, by directive. I can't make anybody like it. I can't say the union's not gonna fight it. That's beyond what I'm allowed to control. Does that make sense? It's a separate entity. It's not an official thing. But that's not something that I can control.
Absolutely, but I think it would be pretty powerful if the chief of police were to come out and publicly say that if the elected representative of the people, as you say, chose to have an outside agency have actual power to have actual change happen, that you would support that.
I support whatever the borough council think is appropriate for our town. I don't know how plainer I can say it. Thank you.
Okay, we have two more.
So I just want to address that since you're referring to the borough, or he's referring to the borough and council. Certainly, this is a subject that we need to talk about as a governing body and make a decision on. Right now, and I don't know if anybody from the Human Relations Commission is still in the room, in the past, the Human Relations Commission has served as that kind of body. I don't know why it stopped, but it stopped before I became mayor. And that's something that, I think we should look into. Dr. DeLacy has been...
We discussed this and it didn't. In a council meeting, we discussed it.
It never really
did.
It was supposed to, and it was originally called the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, but they
But it never did that.
We didn't have that on power when I was on.
Okay, all right, so...
We had that discussion in a council meeting.
Okay, so I was under the wrong impression. However, that is a body that currently exists. If we decide that that is an area that they can pick up on, that's a possibility. However, I'm not saying that the discussion will not be held. It will be held. You don't have to make faces at me.
I think we're having the discussion, right?
No, I'm talking about the governing body. There are plenty of us here tonight that are hearing what's being said. That is a discussion we can have. Dr. DeLacy has been wonderful in advising us in many different areas, as has Chief Spruill, who has been a mentor to the new chief and captain. Those are people I would call on to advise us as well. And so what I'm saying to you is, what the chief keeps saying is, it's not a decision he can make. It's a decision that the governing body can make.
But we've heard tonight, everyone supports it.
Everyone in this room. So
Okay,
it's something that needs to be
we're going to go
enhanced.
to the last two questions because the night is far spent. Question over here?
I just had a follow-up on the same issue, and I guess sort of one, Gail, if you're answering questions, or Madam Mayor, if you're answering questions, I'll ask one for you too, but It sounds, I understand you don't get to decide whether there's gonna be a civilian review board, but I have no doubt that the mayor and council will be consulting you about the operational impact of it. And it sounds like to me that you really don't have a strong feeling that a civilian review board will impact the department operationally. So I hope you can.
It's not something I've ever thought of before. I've been chief for 6 months. I've never researched it. I don't know what the benefits and the detractions are. I have no information on a civilian review board and how it works in a small 27-person police department would work. I can't give you an answer either way. I can't give you an opinion either way because I literally have no idea where to start even. So that's where I'm at.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe based on what the mayor is saying that it would be a good idea to start looking into that so you can
Yeah, absolutely. And
have
that's,
an
again,
operational opinion.
one of the reasons why we have these forums. These things come up, and now I have something else to look into, something else to research. But I mean, that's why we're here, right? So
Okay.
I can hear the people in the town, and you can hear me, and we might not always agree, but we try to get to yes. Sometimes it's a no, and we all learn a little bit. So that's where we're at.
And Madam Mayor, if you don't mind, my basic understanding, and maybe this is just based on one conversation I'm misremembering, is that the union contract is currently in the process of being negotiated.
That's correct.
And I just want to make sure that you and whoever's negotiating it has in mind that there isn't going to be anything in the contract that would prevent the creation of a board like that.
Yeah,
so that we don't hear, oh, well, we're now considering it, but that we can't because of the union contract.
Right, I don't believe that was in the contract in the past either.
It can't be in the contract. I was a terrible union member, but I don't think that anything in the contract could preclude the governing body, the appropriate authority, from determining if that's appropriate for our jurisdiction or not. I don't believe that there's anything the union can do to say in the contract, section 4, paragraph 2, there will never be a civilian review board. That's just not going to work. So it's going to be a discussion that the governing body has to have and figure out how we implement it with what we already have and figure out how to make it work, if that's what they want to do.
Our final question for the evening.
There's been a certain amount of fairly tight questioning, and I think very well answered to in some sense. I'm going to be a bit more free-form. I do want to thank you for actually coming before this crowd and trying to respond, both of you. I've had some experiences with the police department over decades. I came in 1974 and lived on the same street with 2 different houses. I have the feeling that training has been done, and one observation one could make is it doesn't work. I am in a state of despair at this point. The complaints about this department I heard very early on. One of them was, if you're in Highland Park, and this is not a complaint in some ways, you might not get that ticket that perhaps somebody from outside of Highland Park would get. I have the impression that there is a history of, and recent in the sense of hearing from a mother of a classmate of my son when he was still in the Highland Park school system, that her black son was harassed by the police as he was coming back from the high school 2 or 3 hours after the end. I have every reason in the world to believe her. She is a truthful person. And I have read of instances of black children being harassed. I think that's an appropriate word. When they were in their own neighborhood and entered their own home. It's not something I witnessed, but I've heard it repeated more than once, and I feel great despair. I don't think training works. Maybe there's something else that can be done. I find the idea that there might be some statistical studies of this department interesting, but I'm not sure that they will give the key. And I do find it rather striking that statistics were just destroyed. Yes, I can hear all of that stuff about, oh, it's on paper. We don't keep paper more than 2 years or 3 years. Our hands are tied. These are other sorts of things to say. I don't have any opinion about this sort of thing or that sort of thing. I am beholden to the elected officials, and of course, that's an aspect of this. But some police and some police departments and some heads of police departments have opinions that might actually be important to listen to. And we've listened to many of the opinions of both of you gentlemen. And I appreciate that you've been here to share those opinions or lack of opinions. I despair for decades. And I have witnessed, I cannot believe that I would recognize all the instances in which my skin gave me some privilege, nor do I know necessarily of instances of someone's child with black skin being mistreated. I can certainly read about it. I am in despair. Something better than, oh, my hands are tied. Oh, I don't have an opinion. I've been in the Highland Park Police Department for all these years, and now I don't mean this to be personal, but it is one of the things that sort of pops up in this room. And the idea that somebody would claim to be a friend of someone and provide information that had not come out previously, at least to my knowledge, in front of our own eyes. I am in despair. Something different might need to be done, and maybe it will be done. I'm not sure what that something different would be. Maybe it would be some level of, let's call it honesty and sincerity and more direct human contact and grasping how somebody else feels in their own skin in contexts that we may not ourselves be directly experiencing. I am in despair.
At this time, there's no additional questions, for the night is far spent, and I have to be on a flight in the morning. So I'm going to thank everyone for coming out. I'm going to thank Dr. DeLacy and his team for coming and sharing with us. I also want to thank our own police department for coming out and sharing and for continuing to have these kind of discussions. These frank discussion may be unpleasant at times, but they all need to be had, because this is the only way we're going to grow as a community, is to continue to have these discussions and to see how we can fix and how we learn and how we grow from these experiences. So thank you all. Keep the questions coming, and let's find a way how to fix them. Have a good night.